Keith Wayman Gentry, born October 3, 1975 in Waco, Texas, grew up in a simple, hard-working family. From a young age, Keith showed an interest in engineering, which eventually led him to pursue a career in engineering. He was educated at the University of Texas at Austin, where he stood out as a capable and conscientious student. After graduation, Keith took a job with a large engineering firm in the city of Robinson. Here he showed responsibility and became a valued employee capable of handling the most challenging projects. His co-workers and friends remarked on his friendly nature and willingness to help. Keith was a man who knew how to balance work and family. He adored his 3 sons and spent every spare minute with them, teaching them simple life skills from fixing a bicycle to playing baseball. Darlene Gentry, née Darlene Webster, was born in 1979 in the same county. She was a cheerful girl with a colorful appearance that attracted attention. After graduating from the local high school, Darlene attended college. She had always dreamed of having a large family, and when she met Keith, she thought her dreams were beginning to come true. Keith and Darlene met in the mid-1990s at a local party. Their relationship grew quickly and the couple married 2 years later. Keith was fascinated by Darlene's energy and she, in turn, appreciated his stability and commitment to taking care of his family. A few years after the wedding, the couple had children. On the surface, their lives seemed perfect. Keith worked hard to provide for his wife and children, and Darlene managed the household and engaged in the upbringing of sons. However, behind the facade of happiness hid problems. Darlene, according to the stories of acquaintances, always strived for luxury, which sometimes strained Keith. She often discussed with her friends her dreams of a large house, expensive cars, and travel. Keith, although earning decent money, adhered to the principles of economy, which became a cause of conflict. In addition, Darlene, despite her love for her children, seemed tired of the family routine. In recent months, their relationship had become increasingly strained. Keith said nothing to his friends about his worries, but some noticed that he became brooding and more silent. He always avoided scandals, preferring to smooth over conflicts. Darlene, for her part, often complained to her friends about the lack of attention and the lack of luxury in their lives. That day, November 9th, 2005, began like any other. Keith, as usual, woke up early, around 6 a.m. He planned to take care of urgent work projects so that he could finish them by the end of the week. He had a cup of coffee in the kitchen, where everything was neatly organized. Darlene always made sure the house was in order. The house on Shannon Lane was small but cozy. The Gentry family had lived here for a long time, and the neighbors knew them as a decent, friendly couple. The quiet street with occasional cars passing by was the perfect place for a family with children. Darlene also woke up early but, she said, felt unusually tired. She stated that she had intended to help the children with their morning school pickup, but the children were already at a relative's house that day, according to her testimony. Thus, only Keith and Darlene were in the house. At approximately 6:15 a.m., a loud noise was heard. Darlene later claimed that she heard someone breaking a glass door at the rear of the house. She allegedly ran out into the living room and saw the stranger grab a gun from a glass cabinet. She claimed the intruder pointed the gun at Keith, who was in the bedroom at the time, and opened fire. It all happened so fast, Darlene would later tell police, "I didn't even have time to see his face." The stranger left the house through the backyard, taking the gun with him, she said. Darlene immediately called 911. In the audio recording, which investigators will later listen to, her voice sounds agitated. "Please come quickly, my husband is hurt. There was a burglar here." Her desperation seemed genuine. She added that Keith was lying on the bed and showed no signs of life. When officers arrived on the scene, they found Keith on the bed in the master bedroom. He was still alive, but his condition was critical. He had a gunshot wound to the head, and doctors who arrived a little later realized immediately that there was little chance of survival. Keith was taken to the hospital where doctors declared him brain dead. Hours later, he was taken off life support after Darlene signed the paperwork. When police officers arrived on the scene, Their attention was immediately drawn to the strange atmosphere of the house. Despite the emergency call and the report of an armed attack, there were no signs of forced entry in the house. The front doors remained intact, the windows were not broken, and even the glass gun cabinet, which Darlene said was the source of the stolen gun, looked as if it had simply been opened with a key. Keith was lying on the bed in the master bedroom. He was in his pajamas. One of his arms dangled slightly off the edge of the mattress, and a blood stain was visible on the pillow. At first glance, the scene looked like an assault committed while the victim was asleep. However, experienced detectives who arrived on the scene immediately noticed the inconsistencies. First, the position of Keith's body did not match the version Darlene had described. The gunshot to the head had been fired at close range, but the lack of obvious signs of struggle or panic in the room raised questions. Normally, even in a surprise attack, the victim would instinctively try to defend himself or herself or fight back, but here it looked too neat. Second, the house was in perfect order. This was unusual for a robbery scene. Thieves rarely leave the scene of a crime without leaving behind a mess. Overturned furniture, traces of a search for valuables. In this case, it looked as if no one was looking for anything. Investigators paid particular attention to a glass cabinet in the living room where the family's weapons were kept. Darlene claimed that the assailant had opened it and taken the gun, but as it turned out, the cabinet was locked with a lock, the key to which was kept in a prominent place. The lock was undamaged and all other gun paraphernalia was still in place. If this was a robbery, the perpetrator wouldn't have taken the time to carefully open the closet, said Detective Dan Harper, one of the investigators on the case. Besides, if he already had a gun, why risk stealing another one? Darlene Gentry was in the living room at the time the police arrived. She was wearing a robe and looked anxious, but showed no signs of severe shock. This immediately alerted investigators. Most people who witness an attack or the death of a loved one are usually in a state of panic, but Darlene, although appearing agitated, answered questions clearly and without hesitation. "He just barged in," she repeated. "I didn't even see him leave." When asked for a description of her attacker, she was vague, claiming it happened too fast. Investigators focused on her account of the noise that allegedly occurred when the burglar entered the house. She described the sound of breaking glass, but after inspecting the entire area, police found no shards, either in the house or in the yard. The yard was thoroughly checked for shoe prints or other signs of an intruder. However, nothing of the sort was found. The area around the house was a grassy lawn where footprints should have been left, but the ground looked untouched. This raised doubts about the veracity of Darlene's version. Another oddity was the behavior of Darlene herself. Despite the early hour, she looked perfectly put together. Her makeup was in place and her hair was neatly styled. For someone who had just survived an assault and called the police, this seemed unusual. She was clearly hiding something. Detective Harper later recalled, it was evident in her manner of responding. She was too confident for someone who had just lost her husband. A key detail was the fact that Keith's caliber handgun was indeed missing. Darlene claimed that it was the only thing the robber took with him. However, it would later turn out that this weapon would play a crucial role in solving the case. Investigators recorded all the details and submitted Keith's body for forensic examination. The preliminary conclusion confirmed that the shot was fired at close range, possibly within a few centimeters. This rejected the version of a random attack. After examining the crime scene, investigators had a string of questions. Why didn't the perpetrator steal anything but a single gun? Why were there no signs of forced entry or clutter in the house? And why did Darlene act as if she had prepared for her witness role in advance? These inconsistencies caused the police to focus their attention on Darlene as a possible suspect. But for now, they weren't jumping to conclusions. It was obvious that more evidence would be needed to solve the case, and the story itself would be more complicated than it seemed at first glance. After examining the crime scene and interviewing Darlene Gentry for the first time, investigators began to develop possible theories of what had happened. Initially, they did not rule out a robbery scenario, but the lack of forced entry, evidence of intruders, and Darlene's suspicious behavior led them to consider a staged crime. "It could have been a perfectly planned crime," said Detective Dan Harper, but too many details didn't add up. It looked like a play where someone made mistakes. The key element was the gun cabinet. Examination of the lock showed that it had not been forced open as Darlene claimed. What's more, the key to the cabinet was in one of the drawers of the living room table, a place well known to any family member. To the police, this was the first signal that the burglar might have been someone close to the family. The investigation began to look into the financial history of the Gentry family. It turned out that there were 2 large insurance policies in Keith's name, totaling $750,000. The policies included a clause that transferred the entire amount to his wife in the event of his death. Darlene, despite an outwardly stable life, was having financial difficulties. In recent months, she had made major purchases, including a new automobile, and had even discussed with friends the possibility of moving to a larger home. Financial records showed that the couple was under the pressure of debt, and although Keith continued to work, his earnings did not cover Darlene's growing demands. "She loved luxury," said one of Darlene's friends. "All the time she kept saying she wanted a bigger house, a better car. She said she deserved more." After piecing together these facts, investigators began to suspect that a financial motive may have been the basis for the crime. Darlene didn't limit herself to the passive role of widow. Just days after her husband's death, she contacted the insurance company to apply for a payout. She was also interested in selling the house and was considering buying a new one, despite the fact that the funeral had not yet taken place. This behavior angered Keith's relatives. His parents, who had always been supportive of Darlene, began to question her sincerity. "She acted like nothing had happened," Keith's brother recalled. "Even at the funeral, she seemed calm, like she didn't care." Darlene Gentry's first arrest occurred on November 27, 2005, a few weeks after her husband's murder. Up until that point, investigators had focused on analyzing evidence and interviewing witnesses in an attempt to verify her version of the armed attack. However, evidence soon began to suggest that Darlene may have been directly involved in the crime. A major factor in the arrest was the inconsistencies in her testimony. Changing details about where she was, what she saw, and how she acted during the alleged attack raised serious suspicions among investigators. By then, police had already determined that the house showed no signs of forced entry and the glass gun cabinet was undamaged. This contradicted her initial theory of a loud break-in. Additional attention was drawn to Darlene's behavior after her husband's death. She immediately applied for an insurance payout, and her actions appeared to be hurried and businesslike, rather than those of a bereaved widow. Moreover, in conversations with friends, she began discussing the purchase of a new home, showing that her plans were in contrast to the situation of mourning. These moments were crucial to the first arrest. Suspecting that Darlene may have staged the attack to cover up her involvement in the murder, the police decided to detain her for further questioning. Despite the seriousness of the charges, Darlene was able to be released on bail after her initial arrest. The judge set the bail amount at $50,000, and Keith's parents, still unaware of their daughter-in-law's possible guilt, contributed the money to support her. They truly believed that Darlene could not have committed the murder and that what happened was a tragic coincidence. While at large, Darlene continued to assure everyone of her innocence. She avoided talking to journalists and tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. However, her behavior under police surveillance became increasingly bizarre. Her attempts to buy a house with a pond and her insistence on draining the pond caught the attention of investigators, who began to consider the possibility that she might have gotten rid of evidence. Darlene's initial arrest did not yield immediate results, as the evidence collected was not enough to bring definitive charges. However, investigators continued their investigation, focusing on her behavior and financial actions. These efforts soon led to important discoveries that were crucial to the rearrest and indictment. A key break in the case was Darlene's behavior after she was released on bail. Investigators noticed that she was showing a persistent interest in an old house with a pond that she was considering buying. That house was for sale, but Darlene, instead of discussing the details of the deal, kept talking about the pond, insisting that it be drained. Police suspicions were heightened when Darlene was spotted in the neighborhood one day. She was looking for something by the pond, pretending to study the area. Investigators decided to check out the site and drain the pond. The results of their efforts were startling. At the bottom, they found Keith's gun, the same one that Darlene claimed had been stolen by the burglar. The important point was that Darlene, unaware that she was under surveillance, was videotaped. The camera recorded her walking around the pond and making motions as if looking for something in the water. This became one of the main clues linking her to the location of the weapon. In addition, analysis of the weapon showed that it had been recently used, and ballistics testing confirmed that it was the gun that fired the shot at Keith. She tried to get rid of the evidence, but she did it so obviously that she gave herself away, one of the detectives recalled. When investigators presented Darlene with the video and forensic results, her behavior changed dramatically. She began to confuse her statements, claiming she didn't know how the gun ended up in the pond and that she was just looking around the area. But her explanation didn't hold up to scrutiny. By then, police had enough evidence to press charges against her. Darlene Gentry was arrested a second time in late November 2005. This time, police had strong evidence to formally charge her with first-degree murder. The investigation, initially centered on a robbery theory, finally shifted to suspicions of a staged crime. Newly arrived police officers at her home apprehended Darlene right in front of her neighbors, causing a wave of surprise and shock in their small community. The neighbors, accustomed to seeing her in the role of caring mother and hostess, were stunned. Darlene seemed to have expected this development. She met the police officers calmly, even too cold-blooded for someone accused of such a horrible crime. Her calmness was perceived as odd, to say the least. "I didn't do anything," she declared as she was led to the patrol car. Still, her words sounded like a prearranged phrase rather than a sincere outburst. This time, the judge set bail at $500,000, making her release unlikely. Unlike the previous case where her parents had secured bail, they now lacked the funds. Darlene remained in custody pending trial while investigators continued to gather evidence. Darlene Gentry was questioned several times during the investigation. Initially, her account of events sounded convincing, but as investigators asked more questions, her version became less and less consistent. These discrepancies in her testimony played a key role in the construction of the prosecution's case. In her initial interview, Darlene claimed that on the morning of the assault, at approximately 6:15, she was in the kitchen when she heard a loud noise that sounded like a door being broken into. She rushed into the living room, she said, and saw the figure of a man who opened a gun cabinet, took a gun and headed into the bedroom where Keith was. A few seconds later, she heard a gunshot and then the sound of running footsteps. Darlene reported that she immediately called the police. This account seemed plausible, but immediately raised questions for investigators. First, there were no signs of forced entry in the house. Second, the gun cabinet was locked, and the key was in a drawer in the living room that only family members had access to. These inconsistencies warranted a second interrogation. During the second interrogation, Darlene changed some details of her story. She now claimed that she may have left the key to the closet in an accessible place, which could explain how the burglar opened it so quickly. She also added that the gunshot did not happen immediately, but a few seconds after the assailant left the living room. She also gave a description of the man, stating that he was of medium height and wore dark clothing. These details did not match her first statement, where she said she could not get a good look at her attacker. Investigators noticed that her changes looked like an attempt to adjust to their questions. For example, the information about the key and the delay between the noise and the gunshot came only after police pointed out that there were no signs of forced entry and found the key in a locked drawer. At the third interrogation, Darlene made even more changes. She stated that she was not in the kitchen but in the bedroom at the time of the noise. This contradicted her original version. She also said that she hid in the bathroom after the shooting and did not come out until the house was quiet. This contradicted her statement that she immediately called the police. Darlene also changed her version as to how the burglar left the house. While she initially said she did not see him leave, she now claimed she watched the man run out the back door. Investigators noted that there were no such footprints. Darlene's testimony kept changing, making her story less and less believable. Her stories included more and more details that were not in the initial interviews. The location she was in at the time of the alleged attack changed several times, as did her actions after the shooting. These inconsistencies, along with the inconclusive description of the robber, led investigators to conclude that Darlene was attempting to confuse the investigation. Investigators realized that Darlene was changing her story in an attempt to fit the inconsistencies identified by police. These inconsistencies heightened suspicions of her involvement. Prosecutors used them in court to prove that her stories were an attempt to confuse the investigation and hide the truth. Darlene Gentry's story quickly became a major topic of discussion in McLennan County. Prior to the murder, the Gentry family was considered role models. Keith was a respected engineer and Darlene was a caring mother of 3 children. Their neighbors recalled how they took walks in the park together, had parties, and always seemed happy. When news of Darlene's rearrest spread, public opinion was divided. Some believed that the police had found the culprit and the case would be closed quickly. Others, however, doubted that Darlene could have taken such a step. "I don't believe she could have done this," said one of her acquaintances. "She has always been a loving mother and wife." Soon, however, new evidence emerged that reinforced the doubts. Darlene's acquaintances said she often complained about financial difficulties and expressed dissatisfaction with the lifestyle Keith could offer her. Her friend recalled a conversation where Darlene lamented that she deserved more. "She always said she could live a better life if her husband earned more," she said. After her rearrest, Darlene remained in the McLennan County Jail. There was no attempt on her part to convince the public of her innocence. She avoided talking to reporters and preferred to focus on preparing for trial. Her attorney argued that the police didn't have enough evidence to charge her with first-degree murder, but the evidence uncovered said otherwise. Darlene kept surprisingly calm. Prison guards noted that she avoided talking about her children and her husband. Instead, she inquired about the timing of her case and often spoke with attorneys about her defense. Some inmates who shared a cell with her recalled that Darlene tried to show herself strong, but sometimes her behavior became nervous. "She was cold," one guard recalled. "Not once did I see her cry." That doesn't sound like the behavior of someone who is worried about her family. Meanwhile, Darlene and Keith's children remained in the care of his parents. Darlene took no active interest in their fate, further reinforcing the public's perception of her indifference. For many, her behavior was a confirmation of guilt, although the trial had not yet officially taken place. Darlene Gentry's trial began in February 2007. The small McLennan County courtroom was packed to capacity as family, friends, reporters, and residents came to hear the details of the tragic story that shook their community. Darlene, appearing in the courtroom, looked confident. She opted for strict clothing and kept a calm demeanor, at times even too much so for a woman accused of murdering her own husband. However, her calmness seemed more ostentatious than real, especially in the eyes of Keith's parents, who observed her behavior with pain and anger. The prosecutor's office presented the jury with a compelling sequence of evidence. The first and most important was the weapon, Keith's gun, found in the pond, which Darlene herself actively examined. Ballistics testing confirmed that it was the weapon that fired the fatal shot. The second important piece of evidence was a video that captured her behavior near the pond. The prosecutor emphasized that Darlene was not just there at random but was clearly looking for something. This fact, supported by the testimony of neighbors and employees, only increased suspicion of her guilt. An analysis of Darlene's financial actions was also presented. Prosecutors emphasized that just weeks after the murder, she began actively looking for a new home using some of the insurance proceeds. She contacted a real estate agent and even made a down payment on a larger, more expensive home. This fact angered the jury because it demonstrated that instead of mourning for her deceased husband, Darlene was focused on realizing her financial plans. Witnesses from the inner circle also testified in court. Keith's parents testified that Darlene quickly organized the sale of the family home and did not consult with them about the future of their children. Keith's sister recalled that Darlene seemed overly rational and almost indifferent to the tragedy. A friend of the defendant added that even before the murder, Darlene talked about her dreams of a better life and mentioned the amount of insurance money. All of her actions after Keith's death, the prosecutor said in closing argument, show her true intentions. She planned this crime to get the money and start a new life, but did not calculate that the truth would come out sooner or later. After the verdict was announced, Keith's parents couldn't hold back tears. His father stood up from his seat holding his wife's hand and quietly said, "At last justice has been served." Afterward, they openly shared their pain with the press. "It was horrible to watch the man our son trusted with his life destroy it for money," Keith's mother said. After the trial, they took custody of their 3 sons, realizing they had a difficult road ahead of them. "It's hard," Keith's mother admitted to reporters, "but we're going to make sure the kids know what a wonderful man their father was." On February 6, 2007, Keith's murder trial began. After 5 hours of deliberations, the jury found Darlene Gentry guilty of first-degree murder. The next day, the court sentenced her to 60 years in prison, the maximum term without parole for the next 30 years. The judge noted that the motive for the crime, greed, made the case especially grave. Darlene took the verdict stone-faced, showing no emotion. Her lawyer said he would appeal, but it was clear to most observers that the evidence against her was too strong. In 2017, 10 years after the verdict, Darlene attempted to challenge the verdict by filing an appeal. She argued that her defense was insufficient and that the court failed to consider some important aspects of the case. However, her appeal was dismissed. The court ruled that the evidence presented left no doubt about her guilt, and there was no reason for reconsideration. Jordan Lynn Graham was born in 1991 in the small and quiet town of Kalispell, located in the state of Montana. Her working-class parents raised her in a strict but friendly environment with a strong emphasis on family values and religious upbringing. From an early age, Jordan showed an interest in church ministry and was active in youth programs, which solidified her reputation as a disciplined and humble girl. In high school, she was an average student, not seeking leadership or participation in community activities, preferring to spend time with close friends or in prayer. After high school, Jordan enrolled in community college where she studied basic parenting, dreaming of working with youth. Despite her shyness, she was known among her friends as a quiet and devout girl who participated in church activities. Her environment described Jordan as quiet and closed off. She did not seek out noisy company and rarely took the initiative to socialize, making it seem as if she tried to live in the shadow of brighter personalities. Nevertheless, her sincerity and loyalty to her principles made her a favorite of the local community. Many acquaintances remembered her as the perfect girl to start a family, for Jordan seemed to embody the traditional ideals of modesty, hard work, and obedience. Cody Lee Johnson, on the other hand, grew up in a different world. He was born in Deer Lodge, a small but active town where his family ran a small business. From childhood, Cody stood out for his upbeat personality, energy, and confidence. At school, he actively participated in sports competitions, was captain of the basketball team, and always found a common language with others. His charisma attracted people to him, and he easily became the soul of any company. After graduating from high school, Cody found his calling in the automotive industry, starting to work as a manager in a car dealership. His ambitions went far beyond his current job, and he dreamed of one day opening his own business. Sociable and charismatic, Cody's friends recalled that his main trait was his ability to see the best in people. He was an optimist and always sought to support those who were in difficult situations. It was this trait that may have played a key role in his relationship with Jordan. They met at church, a place that became common ground for their so different worlds. Jordan was attracted to Cody by her restraint and devotion to tradition, and Cody in turn won her over with his charm and confidence. Their relationship developed rapidly, although it seemed to others that the couple was too different they found common ground due to their religious views and desire to create a strong family. Just a few months after meeting, Cody proposed to Jordan, giving her a ring, which he carefully chose, trying to reflect in it all his love. Jordan, though hesitant, accepted the proposal, explaining her agreement by saying that she felt God's blessing on this union. However, despite the external harmony, the first warning signs began to appear in the couple's environment. Cody's close friends said that Jordan was too withdrawn and did not always support his active lifestyle. She avoided participating in his social gatherings, often excused by fatigue or busyness. In turn, Jordan's friends shared doubts that she was ready for such a major step. One of her close friends recalled Jordan was always indecisive. When she said she was getting married, it sounded like she was convincing herself, not us. The wedding took place in June 2013. It was a small but solemn event organized with family and friends. Jordan looked gorgeous in a white dress, but according to eyewitnesses, her face did not radiate the joy that usually accompanies the bride. She seemed tense, avoided talking about the future, and barely smiled. Cody, on the other hand, was overflowing with happiness, proudly introducing his wife to all the guests. The first few days of married life were a contrast. Cody seemed to be over the moon, posting photos on social media with the caption, "I am the happiest husband in the world." Jordan, on the other hand, began to become increasingly private, sometimes disappearing for hours at a time and avoiding talking about their plans together. Her friend recalled that a week after the wedding, Jordan texted her, "I think I made a mistake. This is not what I expected." However, Jordan did her best to maintain a semblance of happiness. She accompanied her husband to gatherings with friends and family events, though she did so without enthusiasm. Her coldness was increasingly conspicuous, but Cody didn't want to notice it. He kept telling his friends that he loved her and would do anything to make their lives perfect. Nevertheless, a shadow of doubt began to shadow their marriage. There were more and more misunderstandings in their communication. Jordan claimed she was having trouble adjusting to her new status, and Cody, on the other hand, tried to speed up the adjustment process, not noticing that it was only exacerbating her internal conflict. This tense balance lasted only a week, until one day Jordan suggested a trip to Glacier National Park to spend a day away from the hustle and bustle. Cody happily agreed, unaware that this trip would be their last. Glacier National Park, near Kalispell, is known for its majestic scenery, high mountain ranges covered in dense forest, clear lakes, and winding trails that attract tourists and locals alike. It's a place that seemed perfect for getting away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life and enjoying the silence of nature. However, in early July 2013, this picturesque park became the site of a tragedy that shocked not only those close to Jordan and Cody, but the entire community. Cody Lee Johnson went missing on July 7, 2013. That day, he told friends that he was going to meet up with Jordan, who suggested spending the evening outdoors. However, by late afternoon, his phone stopped answering, which was completely uncharacteristic of him. His friends became concerned but decided that Cody was just spending time with his wife and therefore did not raise the alarm. The next day, Cody didn't show up for work. This alarmed his co-workers, as he had always been known for his punctuality. Soon they reported his disappearance to the police. From the beginning, Jordan looked worried. She told friends and police officers that Cody left the house with friends on the evening of July 7th to go for a car ride and never came back. Her story seemed plausible, however, it lacked details. Jordan couldn't give the names of the people she claimed Cody left with. She also claimed she didn't know where exactly they were headed. The police launched an investigation, and the first step was to survey the places Cody frequented. However, no trace of the man could be found. According to friends, he had not planned any long trips. Cody's car was left in a parking lot near the house, which ruled out the possibility that he had gone far away. All indications were that he left the house on foot or was picked up in another car. A few days after his disappearance, Jordan suddenly told police that she remembered talking to Cody before he went missing. According to her, he mentioned that he was going to go to Glacier National Park. This statement surprised investigators, as she had previously only mentioned him going out with friends. Nevertheless, the police decided to test this version. The survey of the park began with the most popular routes, but the search was hampered by the huge area of the territory. A few days later, Graham suddenly reported that she had found Cody Johnson's body at the foot of a cliff, at a place called Plantleaf Point. This place is known for its steep slopes and dangerous trails, but usually only experienced hikers go there. An examination of the body revealed that he had fallen from a great height. Initially, it looked like an accident, which may have explained the man's disappearance. However, investigators noticed a strange detail. The body lacked the characteristic signs that the man had tried to grab onto something when he fell. These nuances alerted the police, but so far they have not rushed to conclusions. Meanwhile, Jordan continued to exhibit strange behavior. After the discovery of Cody's body, she showed little emotion. Moreover, she herself volunteered to accompany the police to the scene. At the scene, Jordan pointed to the body. She appeared calm, but eyewitnesses noticed that her hands were shaking. This scene became a turning point in the investigation. Police officers began to doubt her version of events and decided to delve into the details of her story. One of the first details that made investigators suspicious was a black cloth eye patch found near the body. It was lying on rocks a few meters from the cliff, as if it had been removed or had fallen by itself. Experts confirmed that it was not a random item. The blindfold had clearly been used recently. Several questions arose. Why would a person in a danger zone be blindfolded? Who could have forced or convinced him to do so? The place where the fall occurred also seemed unusual. The cliff at Plantleaf Point is not just a steep cliff, but an area usually only traveled by experienced hikers. It is notoriously difficult and requires caution even from those who know the area well. Investigators noticed no signs of struggle or attempts to grab onto anything on the slopes, which is typical of people who fall carelessly. This immediately alerted experts and led to speculation that the fall may have been caused by an extraneous influence. Jordan Lynn Graham claimed that she found her husband's body by accident. According to her, she knew that Cody had wanted to visit Plantleaf Point for a long time and decided to travel there herself in hopes of finding traces of him. At first glance, this explanation seemed logical, but investigators noticed her strange behavior. Jordan seemed remarkably calm for someone who had just discovered the body of her beloved husband. In addition, her accuracy in pinpointing where the body lay raised even more questions for the police. When asked why she hadn't immediately mentioned the possible connection between Cody's disappearance and that place, Jordan evasively replied that she hadn't thought of it until later. Her explanations began to raise suspicions, especially when investigators learned of her shifting testimony. She first claimed that Cody had left with friends, then said he went to the park alone, and later added that she allegedly didn't realize his whereabouts until days after he disappeared. Key to the investigation was a text message Jordan received shortly before the body was discovered. The text was sent from a number registered to someone called Tony and read, "Cody fell off a cliff. I think you need to know about it." That message, Jordan said, was the first signal to her that her husband might have died. She showed the text to police, saying she had no idea who Tony was, but speculated that it could have been a friend of Cody's. That theory quickly began to crumble. Cody's friends and family confirmed that no one around him had the name Tony. What's more, the format of the message seemed odd. Usually such texts are accompanied by details or personal comments, but here the content was too concise and neutral, as if it was composed on purpose to direct the recipient's thoughts in a certain direction. This begs the question, if Tony really knew about Cody's fall, why didn't he report it to the police? The police requested information about the number from which the message was sent. It turned out that the number was a temporary one, registered shortly before Cody's disappearance and used only a few times. Moreover, analysis of Jordan's phone activity showed that her device was in the same area where the number was registered at the time the message was sent. This coincidence led investigators to strongly suspect that Jordan may have been involved in the creation of this account. In addition, surveillance footage at the entrance to the national park captured Jordan's car on the day she said Cody allegedly left home. The timestamps showed that her car was in the park before the alleged time of her husband's disappearance, completely contradicting her claims that she only drove there after she began her search. After finding Cody Lee Johnson's body and analyzing the circumstances of his death, the police began a series of interrogations of Jordan Lynn Graham, which gradually revealed more and more inconsistencies in her stories. With each interrogation, her testimony became more and more confused, increasing suspicion of her involvement in the tragedy. In the first interrogation, Jordan displayed a calm demeanor and recounted that Cody had left the house to go out with friends. She claimed that he mentioned that he was going for a walk, but did not say where exactly. When asked why she wasn't worried if he didn't come home, Jordan replied that sometimes he could be late, and she didn't see it as unusual. Despite her outward confidence, however, her testimony lacked specific details. When investigators tried to clarify exactly who Cody might have been with, she was unable to provide a single name. This first interrogation became the basis for further analysis of her behavior. In the second interrogation, Jordan began to change her version of events. She stated that Cody had mentioned Glacier National Park as one of the places he wanted to go, even though she had previously claimed that he was going for a drive with friends. When asked why she didn't contact police immediately after his disappearance, she attributed it to confusion. However, her words became increasingly doubtful as Cody was known for his punctuality and did not disappear without warning. At this point, investigators began asking about her own actions on the day her husband disappeared. Jordan initially said she was at home, but then admitted to driving to the park to look for him. Why hadn't she reported this earlier? She justified herself with fear of looking suspicious, which further reinforced suspicion. At the next interview, investigators presented Jordan Lynn Graham with evidence that completely contradicted her initial testimony. Police said that surveillance cameras at the entrance to Glacier National Park had recorded her car on the day of Cody's disappearance. Timestamps indicated that her car had entered the park long before she claimed to have started looking for her husband. When shown the footage, Jordan at first adamantly denied it was her car. She tried to convince investigators that they could have made a mistake or confused the cars. However, when she was provided with detailed footage of her vehicle's license plate numbers, she began to change her story. Jordan now stated that she drove to the park following a hunch like Cody might have been there. However, this explanation raised even more questions. Investigators clarified if she had really decided to look for her husband, why didn't she inform the police or her friends? Her explanations became more and more confused. She was confused about the sequence of events, first claiming that Cody had wanted to visit the park on his own, and then admitting that she might have suggested the idea. When asked how she'd known he'd be at the park, Jordan couldn't give a clear answer. These contradictions reinforced suspicions that her trip to the park was a planned part of the events leading up to her husband's death. The most important twist in the investigation was a message from Tony. Jordan showed it to the police as evidence that Cody had fallen off the cliff and presented it as the first confirmation of his death. However, an analysis of the number from which the message was sent revealed that it was temporary and registered just days before the tragedy. Investigators discovered that Tony was a fake account created by Jordan herself. She had sent the message to herself to give the impression that someone else knew about Cody's death. This fact became one of the most significant in the investigation. The fake account was an attempt by Jordan to cover her tracks and misdirect the investigation. In addition, the nature of the text message looked unnatural and more like a staged message. When investigators confronted her with this evidence, she tried to deny her involvement, but the evidence against her was too strong. When investigators began examining the scene, one of the findings was a black bandage lying a few feet away from Cody Lee Johnson's body. The bandage was lightly stained with soil and dust, as if it had been dropped or had fallen with someone. Its position on a rocky surface not far from the cliff immediately attracted the attention of the experts. The object looked unusual for standard camping equipment and was not something that hikers normally carry with them to such places. The experts took it away for further analysis, realizing that it could be an important piece of evidence. While examining the bandage, the experts found that the inside of the fabric retained traces of sweat, indicating that it had been used just before the fall. The examination confirmed that it was the right size and shape for a blindfold, which means that it could have been used to disorient a person in space. This fact reinforced suspicions that the blindfold may have been placed on Cody at the time of his fall. Investigators also paid attention to the nature of Cody's fall. Trauma experts pointed out that his body did not have the characteristic scratches or injuries that occur when a person instinctively tries to grasp onto something when falling. This meant that he probably did not see the approaching danger. These findings reinforced the significance of the blindfold as a potential tool used to immobilize or disorient Cody before he fell. When investigators showed Jordan a photograph of the black armband during one of the interviews, her reaction was immediate and visibly nervous. Prior to that, she had been relatively calm, even in moments of discussing the details of her trip to the park. At the mention of the armband, however, her voice began to show signs of uncertainty. She stated that she had never seen the item before and didn't know how it could have ended up near Cody's body. But her attempts to deny any connection to the blindfold made investigators suspicious that she knew more about the object than she was saying. After a long period of silence and deliberation, Jordan partially admitted that the blindfold could have been used by Cody in the park. According to her, she suggested he wear it to give him a romantic surprise. The fact that the armband was used was another piece of evidence to incriminate the girl. Her attempts to initially deny any connection to the armband looked suspicious, especially given how nervously she reacted to questions about it. Many noticed that immediately after her marriage in June 2013, Jordan began showing signs of depression. She seemed withdrawn, avoided social gatherings with friends, and increasingly secluded herself. Her close friend later told investigators Jordan seemed frustrated. She said several times that the marriage was not what she expected. One of the main reasons for her dissatisfaction was that she did not feel comfortable in her role as a wife. Jordan avoided physical intimacy with Cody, who, on the contrary, sought to strengthen their relationship through intimacy. This caused tension between them, especially since Cody was open about his desire to build a family. Jordan, according to her contacts, saw these attempts as pressure and felt cornered. She said it scared her, a friend recalled. The tension reached its peak when Jordan began discussing the possibility of ending the marriage with her friends. She mentioned several times that she wasn't sure if she had done the right thing by getting married. In one message sent shortly before the tragedy, she wrote, "I don't know if I can go on living like this. I thought things would be different." Her words pointed to an internal conflict that was growing by the day. Cody, for his part, didn't notice or didn't want to notice these signs. He continued to show his love and posted photos of their life together on social media with captions like, "I am the happiest husband in the world." For Jordan, however, this only added to the pressure. She felt she had to maintain the appearance of a happy marriage despite her growing resentment. Amidst this tension, her decision to take Cody to Glacier Park and the fact that she offered to blindfold him under the pretense of surprise began to take on new meaning. Investigators speculated that Jordan saw it as a way to end the relationship without having to go through the complicated divorce process, which could have affected her reputation and drawn condemnation in a religious community where divorce was not welcomed. After a series of interrogations in which Jordan became increasingly confused in her versions and confirmation of her connection to the fake Tony account, investigators decided to detain her. Jordan Lynn Graham was taken into custody at her home. She was charged with second-degree murder. She remained calm but tried to claim there was a mistake. Her parents said it was a misunderstanding and expressed their intention to defend their daughter. Jordan's arrest became a high-profile event in Kalispell. People who knew her as a quiet and devout woman were shocked. However, the investigation already had enough evidence to proceed to trial. After Jordan Lynn Graham's arrest, her case generated widespread public interest. In Kalispell, a small and close-knit town, many could not believe that a devout young woman could have been involved in a murder. Nevertheless, the evidence gathered pointed to the contrary. The prosecutor's office began carefully preparing for the trial, building a case based on evidence, expert testimony, and Jordan's motives. The prosecution focused on a coherent reconstruction of the events that led to Cody Lee Johnson's death. They argued that Jordan felt unhappy in her marriage and saw no other option but to stage an accident. Prosecutors put forward the theory that she lured Cody to Glacier National Park, taking advantage of his interest in the local sites. offered him a blindfold under the pretext of a romantic surprise and pushed him off a cliff. She then attempted to conceal her involvement by creating a fake Tony account and sending herself a message to misdirect the investigation. Forensic evidence of the scene and Jordan's behavior after the tragedy were key elements of the prosecution's case. Prosecutors have argued that her actions were not only premeditated but also carefully considered, despite the subsequent confusion in her testimony. Jordan's attorneys argued that what happened was an accident. They insisted that Jordan wanted to strengthen her relationship with her husband by organizing a surprise outing, but the situation got out of hand. In their version, Cody himself got too close to the edge of the cliff, slipped and fell. The defense tried to convince the court that the black bandage found at the scene was irrelevant, and the fake Tony account was created in a state of panic. In addition, the attorneys tried to portray Jordan as a depressed and intimidated woman who was unable to cope with the unexpected circumstances. They argued that her errors in testimony were due to her emotional state and not an attempt to cover up the crime. The trial attracted attention not only from local residents but also from the media. The prosecutor's office called witnesses who described the strain on Jordan and Cody's marriage, her repeated complaints of dissatisfaction with family life, and her desire to end the marriage. Experts testified that the nature of Cody's injuries and the circumstances of his fall made an accident unlikely. They pointed to the black armband as a possible tool that disoriented Cody before his fall. The defense tried to discredit the evidence and made arguments about Jordan's physical inability to push her husband. However, the evidence presented, including fake account activity, surveillance footage, and analysis of Jordan's behavior, gradually convinced the jury of her guilt. On March 27, 2014, the court found Jordan Lynn Graham guilty of second-degree murder. The court concluded that her actions were premeditated, although not in the nature of a premeditated murder. As punishment, Jordan was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Michelle Williams was born in 1977 in a small town in North Texas. Her parents belonged to the middle class. Her father worked as a mechanic, and her mother was engaged in raising children. Michelle grew up a cheerful girl who was always in the center of attention. At school, she was known as a bright and active student. She was fond of theater and participated in school productions, where her natural charisma and ability to attract attention quickly made her a favorite of the audience. These qualities Michelle will carry through her life, using them not only to win sympathy, but also to achieve personal goals. After graduating from high school, Michelle decided to pursue an education in business. She enrolled at a local college, dreaming of a career in management, but her ambitions never materialized. Despite a solid start, she was never able to achieve significant success. Working in administrative positions, Michelle was known as a friendly and personable colleague, but often her behavior raised questions. She changed jobs frequently, drawn to new prospects, but never stayed long. Colleagues remembered her as a woman of strong character, but sometimes prone to manipulation, especially if it could benefit her. Michelle's personal life was no less intense. Her first marriage took place when she was only 22 years old, but lasted only 3 years. The second attempt to start a family was equally unsuccessful. Both of these failures put an imprint on her outlook on life. Michelle did not lose her self-confidence, but increasingly began to seek the stability and luxury she saw in other people's marriages. Her dream of real family happiness became more and more distinct. In 2008, fate brought her together with Greg Williams, a man who seemed to be the epitome of everything she dreamed of. They met at a party through mutual friends, and Greg immediately took notice of a bright woman with brilliant manners and an infectious laugh. He was 6 years older than her, but the age difference only emphasized his maturity and stability. Greg was a successful professional building a career in IT and had a reputation for being a quiet, hard-working man. For Michelle, he was the epitome of reliability, and she, in turn, charmed him with her energy and charm. Their romance developed rapidly. Greg, who was previously unmarried, saw Michelle as his first and only love. In the same year after their acquaintance, they married and moved into a spacious house in Colleyville. For Miss Sheila, this union was a new chapter in her life, and she truly believed she had finally found what she was looking for. Greg adored his wife, and the arrival of first a daughter and then 2 sons strengthened their bond. The Williams family looked like a dream come true, a successful husband, a loving wife, and a cozy home full of laughing children. However, as is often the case, the facade of happiness hid problems. Greg was a workaholic, and although he tried to make time for his family, work often took first place. Miss Sheila, used to the attention, was beginning to feel lonely. She increasingly complained to her friends that Greg was becoming distant, spending more time on his laptop than with her. In addition, her attachment to luxury was becoming more and more noticeable. She spent considerable sums on expensive items, home decor, and infrequent travel, which sometimes became the cause of quarrels. Over time, the tension between the couple became noticeable. Greg, as a practical man, was concerned about his wife's spending, and Miss Sheila seemed to think he no longer valued her. These conflicts, however, remained hidden from their surroundings. Neighbors and friends saw them as role models and admired their lifestyle. For everyone around them, the Williamses were the perfect family that manages to combine career, child rearing, and harmonious relationships. On October 13, 2011, at 4:40, Michelle called 911 to report that her husband, Greg Williams, had been shot and killed by unknown assailants who had broken into their home. Her voice, full of tears and despair, prompted the dispatcher to send patrol cars immediately. What awaited police at the scene looked both tragic and bizarre. Michelle met the officers on the doorstep. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying, and her movements erratic. She explained that she was startled by a sound downstairs and went down to check what was going on. "I heard a noise like someone breaking down the door," she said, struggling to hold back sobs. "I went to look, but before I could do anything, I heard a gunshot. When I got upstairs, Greg was already dead." Her words sounded sincere, and at first glance the tragedy seemed obvious: an attack by unknown assailants. The detectives began a sweep of the house. At first glance, the furnishings did not give away anything unusual. The living room was neatly cleaned. The books were in their places, the sofa cushions were evenly stacked. The children's toys were put away in boxes. The kitchen, too, looked perfectly ordinary: clean countertops, a few plates on the drying rack. The house was almost perfectly clean, which was unexpected for a scene where a violent crime was about to take place. The key object, however, was an inspection of the bedroom where Greg's body was located. Greg Williams, a 40-year-old IT professional, was lying on a bed in the master bedroom. He was covered with a blanket, as if he was getting ready for bed. Next to his body was a pillow with a large blood stain on it. The shot had been to the head, and judging from the position of the body, Greg probably hadn't fought back. However, the room didn't look like what violent crime scenes usually look like. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, and no signs of panic. On the bedside table next to Greg stood his glasses, his phone, and a cup of tea. The tea was underdrawn, which seemed natural for a man who was preparing to go to bed. Police focused on these details as they could shed light on the last minutes of the man's life. Michelle's room across the hallway looked untouched, and the beds of the 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, still had neatly folded blankets on them. The children appeared to be sound asleep in their rooms and had not heard what had happened. There were no signs of disorder in the house. Burglars usually leave behind chaos: open drawers, scattered items, stolen valuables. But in this case, the Williams house remained as it had been the night before. Even in the master bedroom where the tragedy occurred, everything was in its proper place. This raised a lot of questions for investigators. Why did the intruders break into the house and kill Greg, but not touch anything of value, such as the laptop on the desk or the jewelry in the bedroom? As the police searched the house, Michelle stayed close by, her emotions ranging from tears to panic attacks. She answered questions, but her stories were confusing. Michelle's words sounded sincere, but her condition and the details of her story gave the detectives conflicting feelings. The key moment was the inspection of the garden. The officers noticed a gun lying by the back door. Its location looked suspicious, as if it had been left there on purpose so that it would be easily spotted. The divorcing key next to it also looked unusual. It was clean and clearly had not been used for forced entry. Detectives noted this as a possible attempt to create the illusion of a break-in. However, they had not yet drawn conclusions that night, as more detailed analysis was required. Also of interest were the children's toys left in the backyard. They were stacked neatly, which was unusual for a place where Michelle claimed the attackers might have been. The lawn and garden paths also had no traces of dirt or grass typical of a sudden intrusion. These small details did not fit the overall picture of the attack. Police sealed the house and collected all possible evidence. Detectives focused on every item that could shed light on what had happened. This required further investigation, ballistics on the gun, fingerprint analysis, chemical analysis of the tea from Greg's cup, and an examination of all the locks and doors. As night turned to early morning, the Williams family home, which had seemed hours ago a symbol of peaceful family life, became the center of tragedy and mystery. Police were left with many questions. Who could have broken into the house without leaving a trace? Why weren't the children awakened by the gunshot? And why did the attack, according to Michelle's story, end in murder but not affect other aspects of their lives? At this point, investigators were not drawing conclusions, letting the facts speak for themselves. All speculation and conjecture had to be supported by evidence. However, the very setting of the crime scene, quiet and almost undisturbed, continued to evoke a sense of unnaturalness. The tragedy that had occurred in this house concealed more questions than answers. The morning after the tragedy, investigators began a more thorough analysis of the crime scene. Every detail from the gun found by the back door to the cup of tea on the bedside table could be a clue. As the setting was explored, more and more questions arose that began to change the original version of events. The first thing that caught the investigators' attention was the odd arrangement of the objects found. The gun lying by the back door was registered to Greg Williams. This fact raised doubts. Why would the intruders use a gun found in the house instead of coming in with their own? Even more suspicious was the divorce key that Michelle said the attackers allegedly used to break in. However, a detailed inspection of the door revealed that the lock was intact, and the door itself showed no signs of having been forcibly opened. The home's alarm system also drew attention. Normally, the Williams family was strict about security and always activated the system before going to bed. But that night, the alarm system didn't work. When detectives asked Michelle why she didn't turn it on, she said she simply forgot. This moment seemed odd, given that Michelle had always emphasized her concern for the children's safety. While the evidence was being analyzed, investigators continued to observe Michelle's behavior. Her emotions seemed genuine, but her answers to questions were often contradictory. For example, she mentioned Greg's insurance policy several times, explaining that it was to provide for their children. This comment sounded odd in the context of what had happened, as if she was preparing in advance to explain her financial situation. Neighbors interviewed by police recalled Michelle's recent complaints of a strained relationship with her husband. She mentioned feeling trapped in a golden cage and wishing for more freedom. These comments, while not direct evidence, added new context to the tragedy. Another important aspect was the examination of the family's financial records. Detectives discovered that in the months before the incident, Michelle had placed orders on the family's account for many expensive items ranging from jewelry to furniture fittings. This spending apparently caused arguments between the couple, as Greg was more pragmatic and favored a sensible budget allocation. The major discovery, however, was Greg's insurance policy. The payout amount exceeded $1 million, and Michelle was the primary beneficiary. This fact became central to the investigators' version, as the motive of financial gain seemed the most logical explanation. Additional evidence was obtained from Michelle's phone records. A few days before the tragedy, she had contacted an attorney specializing in family matters. This call was suggestive of possible divorce preparations. If Michelle was planning to separate from Greg, could she have been afraid that her financial situation would worsen after the divorce? In addition, family friends mentioned that Greg, shortly before his death, had discussed the possibility of amending his insurance policy to spread the payments among all the children. This fact could have caused conflict and possibly pushed Michelle into desperate action. By this point, investigators had put together a compelling enough picture to focus on Michelle's role in what happened. However, her guilt was still in question. They took their time making accusations, wanting to gather additional evidence that could support their hypothesis. The first thing that caught the investigators' attention was that there were no signs of forced entry. All the doors and windows of the house were intact. The locks on the doors had no damage. The alarm system, although not activated, also showed no signs of tampering. This immediately raised doubts about the intruder theory. If the intruders had indeed entered the house, how? The gun found by the back door and the crescent wrench were among the first objects to be scrutinized. Forensics showed that the crescent wrench had not been used at all, not for burglary, not for any direct purpose, indicating that it was either recently acquired or simply never used. It had simply been left near the door, as if deliberately left there to elicit certain conclusions. The gun, on the other hand, was registered to Greg and was usually kept in a locked safe located in another part of the house. This suggested that the intruders knew the location of the gun and had access to it. How the intruders got hold of the weapon and why they used the homeowner's weapon rather than bringing their own was also unclear. The fact that there were no handprints on these items added an additional shade of strangeness. The detective's attention was also drawn to the cup of tea on the bedside table. The tea in the cup was half drunk, which looked quite natural for a person preparing for sleep. However, experts later found traces of sedatives in the tea. This fact became a key link in the new version of what happened. Could Greg have been sedated before he was shot? Michelle's behavior also raised questions. She seemed emotionally distressed, crying and assuring that she could not believe what had happened. However, her words and actions did not always match. For example, she repeatedly mentioned her husband's insurance policy, claiming that the money from it was to secure their children's future. Her focus on the financial side of the tragedy seemed odd and untimely to detectives. Neighbors interviewed by police did not hear any noise or gunshots that night. However, they said they had noticed tension between the couple in the weeks before the incident. One neighbor recalled Michelle complaining that Greg spent all his time at work and paid no attention to her at all. He spends more time with his laptop than he does with his family, she said. Forensics on the gun showed that the shot was fired at close range. Ballistics showed no signs of struggle or attempted resistance. This indicated that Greg was most likely not aware of the danger when the shot was fired. Moreover, sedatives found in the tea suggested that he may have been sedated before he died. These facts further contradicted the theory of a surprise attack. As evidence and circumstances were analyzed, investigators began to focus on Michelle. Her behavior, financial records, comments from neighbors, and evidence at the crime scene began to add up. However, being charged with such a serious crime required additional evidence. The police took their time, realizing that any mistake could cost a failed case. Special attention was paid to Michelle's psychological state. Her stories of tension in her relationship with Greg, complaints about lack of attention, as well as hints about her desire for more financial independence played a role in building a theory of possible intent. Family friends recounted that Greg had recently discussed changes to his insurance policy. This may have caused Michelle anxiety if she thought she would lose complete control of her finances. A key point was the discovery of contradictions in Michelle's testimony. She persisted in claiming that she heard the noise of a break-in, but the experts found no evidence of forced entry. Her explanation of forgetfulness regarding the alarm system seemed unlikely. Finally, her emphasis on money, especially the insurance policy, looked suspicious. After weeks of careful investigation, detectives felt they had gathered enough evidence to take decisive action. They took their time, realizing that any premature accusation could undermine the case. Nevertheless, new evidence and forensic results finally strengthened their conviction that the key to unraveling the tragedy lay in the hands of Michelle Williams. Among the new discoveries that were decisive were the neighbors' kept footage. Video taken on the night of the tragedy showed no movement around the Williams home, contradicting Michelle's account that the intruders could have escaped through the backyard. Moreover, An analysis of Michela's cell phone revealed that in the hours before the tragedy, she had been in active correspondence with a friend, discussing completely mundane matters. This cast doubt on her words that she was already feeling scared and hearing suspicious noises. Another important link was the results of the analysis of her financial transactions. It turned out that the day before Greg's death, she had transferred a large sum of money to a personal account, which looked like an attempt to prepare for future expenses. This action did not fit the general pattern of behavior of someone who would expect a sudden tragedy. Once investigators had a coherent picture, they called Michela in for questioning. This interview was informal so as not to arouse suspicion. The investigators began with general questions about her life after her husband's death and caring for her children. However, as they talked, they began to ask more detailed questions concerning the night of the tragedy. Michela insisted on her version. She heard a noise, went downstairs, and then a gunshot rang out. But when investigators cited inconsistencies, such as the lack of signs of forced entry or facts about the alarm system, her answers became less and less convincing. For example, when asked why Greg's gun was at the back door, she replied that the intruders may have tried to carry it away with them but then left it behind. The interrogation culminated when she was shown the results of the forensic examination concerning the tea in which the sedatives had been found. At this stage, her behavior began to change. She began to slur her words, and then suddenly stated that she had made the tea herself for her husband, but didn't know there might have been something strange in it. After the interview, investigators decided to issue an arrest warrant for Michela. By this point, they possessed a significant amount of evidence that confirmed her involvement. Among them were forensic results, financial documents, inconsistencies in her stories, and data from her phone records. The arrest was made in the morning, at her parents' home, where she had been living with her children since the tragedy. Michela, according to witnesses, offered no resistance. She seemed calm, although she claimed there had been a mistake and that she was innocent. The Michela Williams trial began in 2014 and immediately caught the public's attention. It was a story about a family that seemed to be the epitome of success and happiness, but tragedy lurked behind its facade. The charges against Michela were shocking. Prosecutors claimed she staged the attack and killed her husband in cold blood for financial gain. Michela, mother of 3, insisted on her innocence, claiming she was the victim of unfair persecution. For weeks, a real drama played out in the courtroom. The prosecution presented one detail after another, building a coherent picture of what happened on the night of the tragedy. Investigators focused on the oddities in Michela's behavior, her accounts of the night of the murder, and little things that seemed to contradict her version of events. They claimed that Michela had planned the crime in advance to take advantage of her husband's insurance policy. This version was based on evidence found, strange coincidences, and expert conclusions. Prosecution witnesses, including neighbors and close family friends, recounted Michela complaining about her husband. Some recalled her saying she felt trapped in a golden cage, dissatisfied with his attention and control over the family finances. Experts confirmed that Greg may have been sedated before he died, and the divorce key found by the back door was not used in the break-in. These details strengthened the prosecution's case that the tragedy was pre-planned. Michela's attorneys built a defense around the idea that the prosecution focused on only one version of events, ignoring other possible scenarios. They tried to show that Michela could not have committed the crime, being a mother of 3 children, and that she was genuinely suffering after the death of her husband. The defense drew attention to the lack of direct evidence of her involvement, arguing that the evidence could be interpreted in different ways. The most difficult part of the trial was Michela's demeanor. Throughout the hearing, she seemed agitated and emotionally distressed, her tears in the courtroom appearing genuine. However, her reactions to some of the prosecution's questions were questionable. When it came to the financial side of their family life, she seemed to have more confidence than when the details of the night of the murder were discussed. After weeks of hearings, the court retired for sentencing. It took the jury 3 days to reach a unanimous decision. Their verdict came as a thunderclap. Michela Williams was found guilty of second-degree murder. They felt the prosecutors were able to prove her motive and actions that led to her husband's death. In 2014, Michela's trial resulted in a 60-year prison sentence with parole eligibility after no more than 30 years. For those who knew the Williams family, it was a shock. Some of Michela's friends had hoped to the last for her acquittal, while others thought the truth had finally prevailed. After the trial, Greg's relatives expressed satisfaction with the verdict, saying that for their family it was an important step towards justice. They emphasized that their main goal was to protect Greg's memory and secure the future of his children. Michela's lawyers filed an appeal, but it was rejected, and the verdict stood. This trial has long been remembered in the local community. It became an example of how a carefully constructed case and attention to detail can help solve a complex crime. But even after the verdict, Michela Williams' case continued to raise questions and controversy. Some saw her as a cold-blooded criminal, while others saw her as a woman victimized by difficult circumstances. Erin Everett was born in 1983 in Jerome, a small town in Pennsylvania. Her childhood was spent in a strict but caring family where the main values were hard work, respect, and following traditions. Her parents raised her in conservative views, and in her youth, Erin tried to meet their expectations. After graduating from high school, she chose a profession related to caring for people and took a job as a certified nurse at Siamone's Lakeview Manor Estate, a nursing home in the neighboring town of Somerset. It was there in 2010 that she met Tori Minnick, a young co-worker who soon became more than just a work partner. Tori Minnick was 7 years younger than Erin. She was born in 1990 in Myersdale Township, also located in Pennsylvania. Her childhood was less stable. Her parents separated and her mother raised her alone, trying to give her daughter a better future. Tori was ambitious, fun-loving, and had an easygoing personality. Unlike Erin, she was not afraid to be herself and openly expressed her feelings. Their rapprochement began with friendship. Joint shifts at the nursing home, lunches before work, jokes in the corridors of the hospital. Tori was the one who filled Erin's life with light. In her company, Everett felt free, as if the heavy burden of constant control had been lifted from her. One day, Erin plucked up the courage to write Tori a message in which she revealed her romantic feelings for her friend and confessed that she would like to have her as a partner. The reply was short and confident. Tori agreed, as she had the same warm feelings. From that moment on, their friendship grew into something more. They began to spend more and more time together, and after a few months, Tori moved in with Erin at her parents' house. Everett's parents, though they noticed the change, preferred not to discuss the subject of their daughter's relationship. They hoped that this is just a temporary infatuation. In the fall of 2010, the young women officially became a couple. Erin made a proposal and Tori agreed. She even wore a ring, but when she came to her family home in Myersdale, took it off, hiding her status. The first few months were full of joy. Dinners together, walks, talking until deep into the night. They made plans. They wanted to move into a separate apartment, to start a new life. Erin believed that she had finally found someone with whom she would be happy. But by the end of 2010, everything began to change. Tori began to go away to her family more often, disappearing for weekends. She answered Erin's messages less and less often, and when she came home, she got irritated over nothing. Gradually, quarrels began to appear in the relationship. Mostly they were about money. Tori spent more than she earned, and Erin had to cover their common expenses, but the main cause of conflict was infidelity. Tori talked more and more about Cody Donaldson, her ex-boyfriend, whom she had been dating since high school. Erin tried to ignore it at first, but soon it became obvious. Tori started seeing him again. "He's just a friend," she said, but the emails and phone calls said otherwise. In the winter of 2011, the fights grew more and more fierce. Tori allowed herself to hit Erin first, jokingly, then more aggressively. She threw things at her, once pushed her in the shower so that a large bruise was left on Everett's back. Erin even went to the hospital to check for injuries. Erin's mother noticed these changes. One day she caught Tori holding her daughter in a chokehold. But instead of intervening, The woman warned her that the relationship would never end well. Nevertheless, Erin remained hopeful that things could be fixed. She said that if she tried harder, she would love her again. But in March 2011, she finally lost that hope. March 25, 2011, in the small town of Jerome, Pennsylvania, started out as an ordinary morning. It was slowly getting lighter outside the window, but the Everett family home was still quiet. It was dark in the basement that served as a bedroom for Erin Everett and her fiancé, Tori Minnick. The air stood still, with only the quiet breathing of a sleeping Tori disturbing the serene atmosphere. Erin sat on the edge of the bed, her gaze fixed on one point. The last few months had been difficult. A relationship that had once seemed happy had begun to fray at the seams. Tori had been away a lot, staying with her family, saying she needed more freedom. Lately there had been fights between them, and Erin felt she was losing touch with the person she considered most important in her life. The morning of March 25 did not portend anything unusual, but soon the silence was shattered by two deafening pops. The loud sounds rolled through the house, making the windows shake. Neighbors flinched, and some looked out the window, trying to figure out what had happened. It was rare for anything disturbing to happen in this neighborhood, much less anyone expecting to hear sounds like gunshots. A moment later, there was the sound of shattering glass. And then, as if in despair, a woman's voice broke the morning silence. This was Erin's account of the unfortunate morning she had lost her loved one, Tori Minnick. With trembling hands, I dialed the number of my mother, Patricia, the victim continued. Her voice was agitated, her breathing confused. When her mother answered, Erin could barely explain that an unknown person had broken into the house. It had happened suddenly. Someone in a mask had been in the basement, grabbed both girls, followed by loud noises, and then the person had quickly fled. Patricia froze, trying to realize what she had heard. Then her voice filled with anxiety. She immediately asked where Erin was, if she was all right. Erin, still in shock, explained that she had not gotten a good look at her attacker, but that she had seen him leave through the garage and drive away in a car. She spoke confusedly, her voice sounding confused. Her mother tried to ask more questions, but she kept repeating the same thing. She didn't understand what had happened or why it had happened. Patricia pulled herself together and emphatically told her to call 911 immediately. The connection broke, leaving a feeling of uncertainty and anxiety. Minutes after emergency services were called, police cars appeared in front of the Everett family home. Red and blue flashing beacons cut through the darkness, reflecting in the windows of neighboring houses. The street came alive as anxious residents looked out their windows, talking among themselves, trying to figure out what had happened in this quiet neighborhood where nothing had ever disturbed the normal flow of life. When the officers went inside, they were met by Erin. She looked frightened and confused. Her eyes were wide open, her breathing confused, her face pale. Her hands were shaking and she was struggling to find words. She must have been in shock. The police officers looked around the hallway. Their attention was drawn to the broken glass on the front door. The shards were inside the house, which could mean that the glass had been broken from the outside. However, they didn't pay much attention to this. In situations like this, details only matter in later analysis. The priority now was to inspect the scene and search for victims. One of the officers stayed with Erin, asking her to sit down and calm down, while the others headed deeper into the house. The basement, according to Erin, was where the worst happened. On the stairs leading downward lay the body of Tori Minnick. Her motionless figure, frozen on the stairs, immediately drew stares. Her clothes were soaked with blood. Traces of blood stretched across the floor, dark stains snaking across the wooden flooring. The room seemed frozen in time. As the police cautiously made their way downstairs, a small living space opened up before them. Despite the lack of windows, the space looked lived in. A double bed, a closet in the corner, shelves of books, a dressing table against the wall. The room seemed cozy, but now there was a heavy, pressurized atmosphere. The police recorded everything that happened, every step, every detail. The forensic team began documenting the evidence, examining the basement, the stairs, the bed, the walls. While part of the team was working in the basement, other officers were examining the rest of the house. It was necessary to understand what had happened here, whether there had been resistance, whether there were any traces of a possible intruder. Every corner was examined carefully. The attention was attracted by traces left in unexpected places, but their meaning was still unclear. Any detail could be the key to understanding what had happened. The search continued, and gradually the picture of the crime began to take shape. While the forensics team worked on the scene, the officers focused their attention on Erin. She was in a state of shock, barely responsive to what was happening around her. Standard protocol was to send her to the hospital for a medical evaluation. If there had indeed been an attack in the house, she could have sustained injuries. However, upon examination, it was clear that she had no visible injuries. There were no signs of struggle, bruises, or cuts. She looked shaken, but was not physically hurt. After the examination, she was transported to the police station to talk in more detail about what had happened. The interrogation room was quiet and cool. Erin sat at the table, her arms crossed, her gaze downcast. She seemed distressed, but perhaps she was still in a state of shock. The officer who was supposed to talk to her sat across from her and studied her closely. He took his time with his questions, giving her time to come to her senses. When Erin began to speak, her voice sounded quiet, broken. She said she had heard rustling noises. There was a stranger in the house. She couldn't see his face, but she could see black clothes. She said the man went down into the basement and then there were loud noises. It happened so quickly that she didn't have time to do anything. After that, she said, the stranger ran out of the basement, went through the house and broke the glass of the door, fleeing. Then she saw him get into a car and drive away. Her hands were shaking as she recounted all this, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. The policeman listened attentively to her story. They didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, just took notes. But with each minute, with each new clarification, the picture of what had happened became more and more complicated. After Erin's interrogation was completed, the investigators began to compare her story with the evidence collected at the scene. Usually the details of a crime gradually come together, but in this case, the more the police analyzed what had happened, the more questions arose. The first thing that stood out was the absence of any signs of struggle on Erin's body. According to her, the intruder attacked them both. He broke into the basement, suddenly attacked Tori, and Erin was next to her, surviving the horror. According to her, it all happened too fast. She didn't have time to react. But if there really was an episode of holding the two girls in the house, why wasn't there any damage on Erin? Police officers are accustomed to crime victims, especially in cases of assault, suffering minor but noticeable injuries. Even if the person didn't fight back, there could be scratches, bruises, pressure marks, or contact blows. But Erin had nothing. Not a single bruise, not a single abrasion, not even a reddening of the skin that would indicate physical contact with her attacker. Investigators made a note that this fact didn't fit the picture. Perhaps she simply offered no resistance. Perhaps the assailant didn't consider her a threat and ran right away. Even so, something didn't add up. The next detail that raised questions was the broken glass on the front door. Erin claimed that the intruder had broken the window while fleeing the house. At first glance, it seemed logical. In a hurry, the perpetrator could have swung, broken the glass, and fled. But when criminalists examined the scene more closely, they saw that all the pieces were inside the house. If someone had broken the glass from the outside, most of the shards would have gone onto the porch. But if it was broken from the inside, it's a different story. At this point, the investigators did not jump to conclusions. A shocked Erin could have simply gotten the details wrong, and that did not necessarily indicate a lie. However, this point was recorded in the reports and sent for further analysis. The next disturbing point was that none of the neighbors saw anyone driving away from Erin's house. She claimed that the intruder had fled in a car that she had seen with her own eyes. However, the police interviewed all the nearest neighbors, but no one confirmed that they had seen a suspicious car that morning. In a normal situation, this might have seemed like a small thing. People could have just been sleeping and not paid attention to the traffic on the street. But this was different. This was a quiet, peaceful neighborhood where any unusual event immediately attracted attention. Even if someone didn't hear gunshots coming from the basement of one of the houses, the noise of a running engine or headlights could have woken someone up. However, Not a single person noticed any unfamiliar automobile. This fact made the investigators even more carefully review all the available information. But the most disturbing discovery was the discovery of criminalists in the garage. During a thorough inspection among the old boxes was found a hammer with stains similar to blood. Experts immediately sent it for analysis, but even without a laboratory report, it was clear it could be the weapon of crime. If the attack was committed with a firearm, why would there be additional blows with a hammer? If the hammer was used as a weapon, why was it hidden in the garage and not near the body? This fact further confused the case. Putting all the details together, the investigators realized that something did not add up. At first, they had considered the attack of an intruder, but now there were too many contradictions in the story. However, the investigators had no direct evidence to question what Aaron had said. All these inconsistencies required further analysis. The investigators decided to focus on scrutinizing all the evidence. They sent the gun for ballistics testing to see if it had actually been fired. The hammer was sent for DNA analysis to find out who the blood traces belonged to and who was holding it. They were also studying the trajectory of the blood traces. If there really was a struggle in the house, it should have left chaotic stains and spatters. But one of the officers already sensed that there would soon be a new version of the story. We just had to wait for the results of the forensics. The catch: while the experts continued to analyze the evidence, the investigators delved deeper into exploring Erin's identity. Now that there were too many inconsistencies in her story, it was clear it was necessary to understand her motives, connections, and possible reasons for what had happened. Earlier, Erin had spoken of her love for Tori, but now investigators were interested in the darker side of their relationship. Interviews with relatives, friends, and colleagues showed that not everything was as serene as it seemed at first glance. According to acquaintances of the couple, since the end of 2010, the relationship between Erin and Tori began to deteriorate rapidly. Tori became distant, more and more often spent time in his hometown Meyersdale, in the house of his family. She no longer hid contacts with her ex-boyfriend, Cody Donaldson, with whom she dated before her relationship with Aaron. Friends said that there was growing conflict between the girls. Some claimed that Tori was rude to Erin, could humiliate her in conversation, allowed himself to mock her feelings. In addition, co-workers confirmed that Tori openly discussed her relationship with Cody, even when she was with Aaron. Investigators realized that what they had in front of them was not just a tragic incident, but a story of deep emotions, jealousy, and hidden pain. But for now, it wasn't enough to draw conclusions. Disturbing correspondence with Billy Nair. The real breakthrough in the investigation came when forensic investigators examined Erin's phone. As it turned out, on the eve of the tragedy, and even on the day of the murder, Erin actively corresponded with Billy Nair. Billy, 27, was the fiancé of Erin's cousin. They were friends, but now investigators saw something more. Erin actively questioned Nair about handguns, what models were available, how to use them properly. She was interested in how to load the gun, where to store ammunition, and what caliber ammunition is most effective. At first glance, the questions may have seemed like ordinary curiosity, but given the subsequent events, they took on a sinister connotation. The police were particularly alerted to the fact that Erin and Nair had discussed the purchase of ammunition. This meant that the weapons were not just in her possession, but possibly planned for use. However, the most shocking message came from Nair's side. In one of the texts, he asked the question, "When will everything happen?" This phrase made it clear that something was already being planned. Investigators realized that Erin could have discussed the details of what happened in advance, which completely contradicted her initial claims of a random attack by an intruder. Upon further examination of Erin's correspondence with Billy Nair, investigators discovered even more disturbing details. Among the messages sent after the crime was one that particularly struck detectives. Billy Nair asked Erin to send him a picture of Tori after the incident. At first glance, the request seemed creepy and unfathomable, but what was most striking was that Erin actually complied with his request. In a return message, she sent him a picture of Tori Minnick. Investigators have begun to find out how involved Billy was in the events. So far, his role in the story has been unclear. While investigators dealt with the digital evidence, experts completed the analysis of the hammer found. The lab test results were key. Aaron's fingerprints were on the handle, and Tori Minnick's blood was found on the head of the hammer. This discovery shattered everything Aaron said. She claimed she never touched the weapon. But now it's been proven that she held the hammer in her hand and that it was the object that struck Tori. This was the final nail in the coffin of the unknown perpetrator theory. Investigators analyzed in detail all the evidence that was collected at the scene of the crime and saw clear inconsistencies in the story of Aaron. She claimed that an unknown attacker had attacked them, but there were no signs of struggle, scratches, or bruises on her body to corroborate her story. In addition, the window that she believed the perpetrator had broken while escaping had been broken from the inside, which contradicted her statement. Interviews with neighbors also yielded important information. None of them had seen anyone leaving Aaron's house that morning. This cast doubt on her claim that the intruder had fled in an automobile. The strongest evidence was the hammer found in the garage. It had Aaron's fingerprints and Tori's blood on it, making her the prime suspect. Additionally, investigators examined Aaron's correspondence with Billy Nair. It was clear from the messages that they had discussed guns the day before the tragedy. Aaron asked questions about guns, ammunition, and their use, and Nair was interested in when everything would happen. These facts completely destroyed her version of the attack. The investigators concluded that Aaron was hiding the truth. It no longer looked like a random attack. Everything pointed to premeditation. As soon as the results of the tests and digital evidence became available, the police officially arrested Aaron Everett. Now she had to answer for her actions. Even so, she continued to insist she was innocent. Investigators knew this story wasn't over. There was a long trial ahead to set the record straight. After Aaron Everett was arrested and all the evidence was fully analyzed, the case went to trial. The prosecution argued that the evidence against her was more than sufficient, and the defense tried to mitigate the guilt, presenting the crime as a tragic accident caused by emotional stress. The trial attracted enormous public attention. Everyone in the small town knew what had happened, and people were divided into two camps. Some saw Aaron as a ruthless criminal, others as a victim of a complicated relationship pushed to the limit. The courtroom was full every sitting day. Tori Minnick's relatives were in the front rows, their faces expressing anger and grief. Aaron's family sat apart, depressed and silent. The atmosphere in the room was tense. The judges listened attentively to both sides, realizing how complex the case was. The parties presented their arguments, the witnesses testified, and a complete picture of what had happened gradually emerged before the judges. The prosecution presented several key pieces of evidence to prove that the murder was premeditated and elaborate. The first major argument was an inconsistency in Aaron's testimony. She claimed that the house had been broken into by an unknown intruder who first attacked Tori and then fled. However, her words were not supported by the evidence. There were no signs of a struggle on her body, no bruises, scratches, or other injuries that would indicate a confrontation with the perpetrator. The next thing the court questioned was the broken window. Aaron claimed that the intruder had kicked it out while fleeing the house. However, the shards of glass were inside the room, indicating that the window had been broken from the inside. This fact undermined the theory of a sudden intrusion by an unknown perpetrator. The prosecution also presented the results of interviews with neighbors who stated that no one had seen the getaway car that Aaron had mentioned. If someone had indeed fled the scene, especially in a quiet neighborhood where any quick movement in the morning would have attracted attention, they would certainly have been spotted. The most serious evidence, however, was the hammer found and the correspondence with Billy Nair. The hammer found in the garage contained Aaron's fingerprints and Tori Minnick's blood. This meant that Aaron had held the hammer and used it, which completely disproved her words that she had not touched the weapon. An even more disturbing element of the prosecution's case was the correspondence with Billy Nair. In messages the day before the tragedy, Aaron asked questions about guns, their construction, and ammunition calibers. They also discussed buying ammunition and how to use it. But the most shocking moment was Nair's question, who wrote, "When is it going to happen?" This detail, according to the prosecutor's office, indicated that the murder was not random but planned in advance. Aaron's defense tried to present the case in a different light. The defense lawyers argued that Aaron was not a cold-blooded criminal, but was in an extremely difficult emotional situation. They detailed the difficulties in the relationship between Aaron and Tori. Witnesses confirmed that Tori was often abusive to Aaron, allowed herself to be taunted, and was physically aggressive. A particularly difficult moment for Aaron was learning of the affair. In recent months, she had become increasingly suspicious of Tori's involvement with her ex-boyfriend, Cody Donaldson. Then she learned that Tori had indeed continued her relationship with him despite their engagement. According to the attorneys, this emotional turmoil left Aaron in a state of despair, and she did not realize her actions at the time. Additionally, the defense tried to prove that Billy Nair could have influenced her. They argued that he encouraged her to think radical thoughts by steering her conversations in the right direction. But despite all these arguments, the defense failed to explain why Aaron sent a picture of Tori Nair after the murder. This moment became a key point for the prosecution, proving that her actions were not chaotic or unconscious. Aaron froze for a moment, sighing heavily, avoiding the gazes of the people in the audience. She began to speak slowly, her voice trembling, but there was a final resignation to the inevitable in her words. She admitted that she had lived in emotional distress for a long time, feeling the pain, humiliation, and jealousy destroying her from the inside out. That night, she woke up with a clear thought. It had to end. She picked up the gun, walked over to the bed, and fired twice. When she realized Tori was still breathing, she was afraid she was going to make it, and in a panic, she grabbed the hammer to make sure it was over. She then put the gun away, broke the glass, called her mother, and made up a story about a burglar. Billy Nair was also subpoenaed. He denied any involvement in the crime, claiming that their correspondence was just a theoretical discussion. However, the prosecution presented his request for a photograph, which cast doubt on his words. The court decided to punish Nair for complicity. After weeks of hearings, the court delivered its final verdict. On March 27, 2013, Aaron Everett was found guilty of first-degree murder. The court sentenced her to life in prison without parole. Billy Nair was found guilty of solicitation on the same day and received 20 years in prison. Ashley Pittman Scott was born in November 1978 in Bossier City, Louisiana. Her life began as the story of a small but close-knit family. Her father passed away when Ashley was just a baby, and soon her mother met Jim Pittman. Not only did he become her new life partner, but he officially adopted Ashley when she hadn't even started school yet. Jim raised the girl as his own daughter, and in their home there was an atmosphere of love and care. From an early age, Ashley stood out for her intelligence and desire for knowledge. In school, she quickly became a favorite of teachers due to her diligence and friendly character. After graduating from high school, she decided to enter the University of Ouachita Baptist in the state of Arkansas. The choice of university was not random. Ashley dreamed of an education that would combine academic knowledge and spiritual development. There she chose to major in English, hoping to share her knowledge with the younger generation. It was at the university that Ashley met Jeffrey Scott. He studied at the Faculty of Business and planned to make a career in the commercial sphere. The first impression he made was difficult to call unambiguous, self-confident, charismatic, but at times prone to ostentatious ego. Despite their differences, however, a relationship quickly developed between the two men. And Jeffrey seemed to Ashley as someone who could become her support, a reliable companion. Their relationship developed rapidly, and in June 2001 they were married. After the wedding, the couple moved to Memphis, Tennessee, where Jeffrey found a job in the business sector and Ashley began teaching English at a local school. She loved her profession, and her students commented on her as an attentive and friendly teacher. Every day she tried to make her lessons not only useful but also fun, inspiring teenagers to learn about literature and language. Her colleagues noted that Ashley always brought warmth and a positive attitude to the team. At first glance, the Scott family seemed perfect. Going to events together, smiles in photos in a cozy home in Memphis gave the impression of harmony. Ashley was deeply religious and tried to follow her moral principles. She strove to support her husband in his career endeavors, even though Jeffrey often worked late or was away on business trips. Their marriage seemed to be built on trust and understanding. From time to time, however, cracks did show. Ashley's friends noted that in recent years she had become more withdrawn. Some noticed that her usual cheerfulness was fading, but she herself never complained. Jeffrey's critics were left to speculation, for Ashley did not allow herself to bring her family difficulties into discussion. She was the kind of person who preferred to save face even in difficult moments. As their relationship progressed, problems began to accumulate in the family. In 2005, Ashley was arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol. This event was a strong blow for her because she had always prided herself on her discipline. It was then, according to friends, that she began to talk openly about problems in her marriage for the first time. Jeffrey seemed to become increasingly detached and irritable. His fits of anger were followed by periods of complete indifference. Ashley said he began to criticize her for everything from her appearance to the way she managed her household. Some of her loved ones even suspected that Jeffrey might be physically aggressive toward her. But Ashley never confirmed these rumors. The situation worsened in the summer of 2006. One day, Ashley called a friend late at night and told that Jeffrey, being drunk, tried to strangle her. This news shocked acquaintances, but Ashley refused to seek help from the police, deciding to give her husband another chance. Nevertheless, her patience was coming to an end. Close friends noted that in the final weeks before Thanksgiving, she was thinking more and more about divorce. Moreover, her car was found with her belongings neatly packed in the trunk, which could indicate that she was ready to move. On November 23, 2006, Thanksgiving Day, Ashley and Jeffrey Scott decided to spend time at home, away from the hustle and bustle and guests. It was a relaxing evening filled with the traditional holiday atmosphere. They enjoyed socializing and, according to Jeffrey, drank wine while discussing plans for the future. At some point, however, a quarrel broke out between the spouses. The reason was, as Jeffrey later reported, an unexpected text on Ashley's phone, which he accidentally saw. Tension grew and emotions took over reason. During the night, Ashley felt ill, but Jeffrey, he said, believed she only needed rest. In the morning, he found that his wife's condition had not improved. Agitated, he began looking for ways to help his wife, who was in a dismal physical condition. On the morning of November 24, 2006, very early in the day after Thanksgiving, Jeffrey Scott made his first call. It was not a call to the police or ambulance, but to his friend, Dr. Robert McGee. In a panic, he reported that his wife Ashley was unconscious and unresponsive to attempts to bring her to consciousness. Robert, a physician with years of experience, immediately realized the situation was serious and rushed to the Scott home to see for himself the woman's condition. Upon arrival, Dr. McGee found Ashley lying on the bedroom floor. Her face was pale, her breathing was absent, and her response to stimuli was completely absent. Robert attempted CPR, but quickly realized his efforts were failing. He urged Jeffrey to call emergency services, but for unknown reasons, the 911 call was not made until an hour later. At 3:46 p.m., medics arrived almost immediately, but their help was also futile. They pronounced Ashley dead on the spot. Along with the medical team, police officers also arrived, as the circumstances of the incident required an immediate investigation. It was from this moment in the Scott house that the thorough work of investigators began. The police officers, while inspecting the house, did not immediately notice anything obviously unusual. The house looked clean and well maintained, with most of the rooms showing no signs of struggle or disorder. However, the bedroom where Ashley was found hid subtle details that experienced investigators couldn't ignore. The floor was covered with a soft carpet, but on it, not far from the woman's body, lay the shards of a broken vase. According to Jeffrey, the vase had broken accidentally during their argument the night before. However, forensic experts recorded that the shards were scattered unevenly, and some of them were at a considerable distance from the main mass, which looked strange. Ashley's body was dressed in casual home clothes, but her position on the floor looked unnatural. Forensics noted that it was as if the woman had been carefully arranged in this pose, rather than falling over accidentally. There were no obvious signs of recent physical abuse on her face or body, but a more detailed examination was left to forensic experts. Several stains were also found on the bedroom floor, initially mistaken for normal dirt or shoe marks, but the experts decided to take them for analysis. During the first interrogation, Jeffrey said that he and Ashley had been drinking on the evening of November 23 while discussing family matters. He mentioned that he happened to notice a message from an unknown man on her phone, which was the cause of their argument. According to him, after the conflict, Ashley went to the garage to be alone and calm down. He claimed that she stayed there until the morning, when he found her unconscious and carried her into the house. However, this version immediately raised doubts among the investigators. First, the time gap between Ashley's deteriorating condition and the call for help seemed too long. Second, police noticed several inconsistencies in his story. Jeffrey stated that he tried to revive her as soon as he realized something was wrong, but judging by the condition of her body, much more time had passed than he claimed. A parallel examination of the garage gave investigators new things to think about. Small stains were found on the concrete floor that could have been a liquid related to the incident. These stains piqued the interest of forensic investigators because they were close to where Jeffrey said Ashley had spent the night. The nature of the stains remained unclear, and they were taken for analysis. From the beginning, police had several hypotheses about what may have happened at the Scott home. The first hypothesis suggested that Ashley may have been injured in an accident. She might have tripped, fallen, or passed out for some other reason. This version seemed the most likely early on, as there were no obvious signs of violence or outside interference at first glance. However, the secondary version was based on the accounts of the couple's acquaintances, who began to share their observations about the strained relationship between Ashley and Jeffrey. In the first hours of the investigation, police contacted Ashley's close friends and co-workers, who pointed out a number of disturbing facts. Some of them noted that Ashley had often seemed depressed in recent months, and said there were serious problems in their marriage. This assumption added a new level of complexity to the case. The third theory involved third-party interference. Ashley's cell phone became the subject of intense scrutiny. The message that Jeffrey said had sparked the argument could have been related to her recent plans to change her life. According to her friends, Ashley recently considered divorce and even consulted a lawyer. CSI found luggage in her car with her belongings, which also pointed to her possible intentions to leave her husband. There was also mail from the two Nancy Wright Mitski's house, but the question remained, could the message really matter, or was it just an excuse for conflict? As investigators dug deeper into the details, the evidence gathered began to form a contradictory picture. One key item that piqued their interest was a print found on the bedroom floor. Its shape and location didn't match the shoes Jeffrey had worn that day, and it led police to wonder if something more complex than a domestic dispute had taken place. In parallel, analysis of the stains found in the garage suggested that their nature could be related to bodily injury, but confirmation of this was yet to be obtained. Forensic experts were preparing to present their report on the condition of Ashley's body, which could provide definitive answers or, on the contrary, further confuse the case. The investigation focused on identifying contradictions in Jeffrey Scott's testimony and analyzing the evidence collected. The first doubts were raised by the time lag between Ashley's deteriorating condition and the emergency services being called. However, it was the small details that proved most significant, which eventually formed a coherent picture. In the garage where Jeffrey said Ashley had spent the night, experts found stains believed to have been left by a bodily fluid. Laboratory analysis confirmed that it was blood, and its location on the floor was not consistent with an accidental fall. Moreover, the nature of the marks indicated that the body may have been moved, leading the police to question Jeffrey's honesty. Forensic experts determined that Ashley had injuries that were not typical of a single blow or fall. There were marks found on her body that could indicate multiple physical impacts. Of particular note was a print found on her skin that resembled the sole of a shoe. This evidence aroused serious suspicion, but the investigation has not yet disclosed its significance. The text message that sparked the altercation turned out to be a standard text from Ashley's co-worker that was work. However, a subsequent analysis of the phone revealed something else. Ashley was in active correspondence with a lawyer discussing the possible dissolution of her marriage. This fact, combined with the packed luggage found in her car, indicated her willingness to leave Jeffrey. The investigation suggested that this may have been the trigger for the conflict. Ashley's friends told police that she repeatedly complained of emotional pressure from her husband. One close friend recalled an incident in the summer of 2006 when Ashley called him at night and told him that Jeffrey had tried to strangle her after an argument. This incident was never documented because Ashley chose not to go to the police, but it has now become an important element of the case. When investigators presented Jeffrey with data that contradicted his version of events, he began to confuse his answers. For example, he claimed that he left Ashley in the garage because she insisted on doing so herself. However, experts determined that the woman's injuries precluded her ability to move around on her own. Additionally, Jeffrey stated that he tried to help his wife immediately in the morning, but could not explain why it took hours before 911 was called. This fact, along with calling Dr. McGee instead of an ambulance, seemed unnatural. Investigators began to consider the possibility that Jeffrey was trying to cover up the evidence of his actions. Before Dr. Robert McGee's testimony was crucial to the investigation. He confirmed that when he arrived at the Scotts' house, he found Ashley unconscious and immediately demanded that paramedics be called. McGee noted that he was surprised at the delay in calling 911, but did not argue with Jeffrey at that point. His description of Ashley's condition and her posture on the floor did not match Jeffrey's story about trying to move her to the bedroom. This discrepancy became another link in the chain of suspicion. Combining witness testimony, forensic evidence, and contradictions in Jeffrey's words, the investigation concluded that the events of that night were more complex than Ashley's husband had attempted to describe. An argument over a text message could have escalated into conflict and then tragedy. Evidence indicated that Ashley may have been hurt as early as the evening before, but help was not provided in a timely manner. This conclusion led police to focus on Jeffrey as the prime suspect. Although investigators did not release details to the public, the shoe print they found became a key piece of evidence. Its shape and size didn't match Ashley's shoes, eliminating the possibility of an accidental fall or self-inflicted injury. This discovery finally strengthened the hypothesis that Ashley's injuries were intentional, but investigators chose not to charge Jeffrey for the time being, waiting for additional corroboration. As the investigation progressed, major suspicions began to focus on Jeffrey Scott. His behavior on the day of the tragedy, numerous inconsistencies in his statements, and evidence found in the house painted a disappointing picture. Investigators noticed that his account of how the events unfolded did not match the forensic evidence. It looked particularly suspicious that Jeffrey had first called a friend rather than the emergency services, and considerable time had passed before he decided to call an ambulance. Key clues such as stains in the garage and a shoe print on Ashley's body, as well as evidence of strained family relationships, heightened suspicions. The couple's entourage confirmed that Ashley had recently planned to leave her husband, which could have been the catalyst for the tragic conflict. Her belongings, packed in the trunk of the car, hinted at preparations for a drastic change. As a result of the accumulated evidence, Jeffrey became a major player in the case. Investigators were convinced that he knew more than he was saying and began to build an accusatory line to bring formal charges against him in connection with the incident. Jeffrey Scott remained under close police surveillance while investigators gathered additional evidence. They continued to verify details of his version of events, while simultaneously interviewing Ashley's close friends and acquaintances. One of the key witnesses was Virginia Brown, Jeffrey's co-worker and former lover, whose words made an important contribution to the case. After the tragic death of Ashley Scott, investigators focused on Jeffrey, who was repeatedly interrogated in an attempt to uncover all the details of the events of that night. With each interrogation, his testimony became less and less convincing, and contradictions in his story helped police get closer to the truth. Jeffrey's first interrogation took place a few hours after Ashley's body was found. He looked worried but kept his cool. Jeffrey said that on the evening of November 23, they had an argument over a text message on Ashley's phone, after which she went to the garage to calm down. He claimed he found her unconscious in the morning, but couldn't explain why he didn't call an ambulance right away. His words seemed logical at first glance, but the details did not agree with the conclusions of the forensic experts. At the second interrogation, Jeffrey began to confuse his testimony. Investigators asked more questions about the time period between when he discovered Ashley in the morning and the 911 call. He spoke of confusion and fear, but the explanations seemed unconvincing. The questions about the bloodstains in the garage were a particularly poignant moment. Jeffrey claimed he hadn't noticed anything unusual, but the experts already knew it was Ashley's blood. During the third interrogation, investigators began pressing Jeffrey with questions about his relationship with Virginia Brown. She told police about an incident in the summer of 2006 when Jeffrey hit Ashley in front of her. Upon hearing about it, he tried to justify himself, calling the incident a domestic dispute. When investigators asked if he knew about Ashley's plans to leave, he became visibly nervous but denied knowing. At the fourth interrogation, the investigators presented Jeffrey with the results of the forensic tests. They said that the stains in the garage were traces of blood, and Ashley's injuries could not have been accidental. Under pressure, he began to remain silent, avoiding direct answers. When asked about the trunk of Ashley's car with her belongings, he stated that he knew nothing about it. But his reaction betrayed an inner tension. By the conclusion of the interrogation, Jeffrey Scott couldn't handle the pressure. The atmosphere in the room was tense, and the investigators bluntly asked him how to explain the bloodstains in the garage and the injuries found on Ashley's body. After a long silence, he lowered his head and uttered, "I never meant for it to go this far." Those words were his first confession, though he tried to portray what happened as an accident. Jeffrey revealed that during an argument with Ashley on the night of November 24, he lost control. He claimed he pushed her in a fit of anger and she fell. He said he was sure she had simply gone into the garage to be alone and found her unconscious in the morning. Investigators, however, did not believe his version of an accident. Ashley's injuries, bloodstains, and witness statements pointed to more serious violence. This partial confession did not exonerate Jeffrey, but only confirmed his involvement in the tragic events, which strengthened the prosecution's case. Virginia Brown played a key role in the case. She was called in for questioning as investigators learned that she was not only close to Jeffrey, but also knew Ashley personally. Virginia confirmed that she did have an affair with Jeffrey that lasted several years, but her account of relationships within the Scott family was a real breakthrough for the investigation. She said she witnessed violence in the summer of 2006. According to her, Ashley arrived at her home one day after an argument with Jeffrey. While the women were talking, Jeffrey arrived unexpectedly, burst into the house, and hit Ashley on the back several times while yelling at her. The incident shocked Virginia, but Ashley refused to go to the police at the time, saying she didn't want to make the situation worse. Investigators also learned that Virginia communicated with Ashley after the incident, and she told them that she felt unsafe but hesitant to leave because of her fear of Jeffrey. This evidence helped the investigation build a motive and show that tension was building in the Scotts' relationship. Virginia Brown's words became one of the crucial pieces of evidence that strengthened the suspicions against Jeffrey. Combined with other evidence, stains in the garage, analysis of Ashley's injuries, and contradictions in Jeffrey's testimony, police were able to convince themselves of his involvement. In January 2007, he was arrested on a second-degree murder charge. The investigation confidently filed charges that were to be tried in court. The trial of Jeffrey Scott, which began in late 2008, was the culmination of a months-long investigation into the tragic death of Ashley Scott. The case caused considerable public outcry, not only because of the horrific circumstances of the crime, but also because of the theme it raised: hidden family violence. At the heart of the proceedings was the question of whether Ashley's death was the result of an accident or a deliberate act on the part of her husband. By the time the trial began, the prosecution and defense had prepared for a serious fight. The prosecutors gathered evidence that they said proved that Ashley's death was the result of long-standing marital problems and Jeffrey's intentional actions. On the other hand, the defense tried to portray what happened as an accident, where emotion and impulsiveness, rather than malice, played a key role. The trial was held at the Memphis County Courthouse in Memphis, Tennessee, and was accompanied by increased public attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters and listeners, eager to hear the details of the tragedy. The prosecution built its case on detailed evidence and testimony that painted a grim picture of the relationships within the Scott family. Evidence of injuries. The medical examiners presented a detailed analysis of Ashley's injuries. They stated that the nature of the injuries, including head trauma and multiple contusions, indicated the use of significant force inconsistent with the accidental fall theory. The experts said the injuries showed evidence of multiple impacts, which confirmed the investigation's findings. Bloodstains. Prosecutors emphasized the bloodstains found in the garage. Lab tests confirmed they were Ashley's. Moreover, their location indicated that the tragedy began there, and then the body was moved into the house. This contradicted the defense theory that Ashley had gone to the garage on her own after the argument. Testimony. One of the most significant moments of the trial was the testimony of Virginia Brown, Jeffrey's former co-worker and mistress. She told the court that she witnessed an episode of violence in the summer of 2006 when Jeffrey hit Ashley in her home. She also testified that Ashley repeatedly complained to her about tensions in the marriage and spoke of her fear of her husband. The prosecutor's office also presented Ashley's correspondence with her attorney, where she discussed a possible divorce. Luggage found in her car with personal belongings was further evidence of her intentions to leave her husband. Prosecutors argued that it was these plans that motivated Jeffrey's actions. Jeffrey's defense stuck to the version of events that what happened was an accident caused by an emotional outburst. The defense attorneys insisted that the conflict between the couple started because of a text message Jeffrey accidentally noticed on Ashley's phone. They argued that the quarrel was common for the couple and did not go beyond a verbal conflict. According to them, Jeffrey accidentally pushed Ashley, and her injuries were the result of an unfortunate fall, psychological state. Jeffrey himself took the stand in court, stating that his actions were unconscious. He said that after the conflict on the night of November 23, Ashley went to the garage to be alone. He found her unconscious the next morning and tried to help her. He attributed the delay in calling an ambulance to confusion, challenging the evidence. The defense also attempted to challenge the relevance of the bloodstains in the garage and other evidence, arguing that they could be the result of previous domestic injuries. They argued that Virginia Brown's testimony was prejudicial because she was in a difficult relationship with both spouses. Key points of the trial. The trial lasted several weeks. The court heard from more than a dozen witnesses, including Ashley's friends, who confirmed her fear of Jeffrey, and staff at the school where she worked. Prosecutors used contradictions in Jeffrey's testimony to demonstrate his attempts to hide the truth. One crucial point was the analysis of the injuries. Forensic experts emphasized that their nature ruled out the possibility of an accidental fall. Especially the jury's attention was drawn to the photos of the injuries, which according to experts indicated a physical impact. In January 2009, the jury reached a verdict, finding Jeffrey Scott guilty of second-degree murder. The court took into account the evidence presented, the testimony of witnesses, and Jeffrey's partial confession. His version of the accidental events did not convince the jury or the judge. In February 2009, the court sentenced Jeffrey to 25 years in prison without parole. The judge noted that the crime was not random and was the result of long-standing marital strain. In sentencing, he emphasized that Ashley's family and friends lost a loved one because of an unwarranted outburst of aggression. Jeffrey Scott is serving his sentence at the Bledsoe County Correctional Facility in Bledsoe County, Tennessee. According to court records, his release is expected in April 2030. This sentence was the final point in a tragic story that left a deep wound in the lives of Ashley's loved ones. Carolina Crouch was born on July 12, 2001 in sunny Athens. Her mother was Filipino and her father was British, making her heir to two different cultures. Carolina's childhood was spent surrounded by ocean breezes and warmth, which symbolized a calm and happy life. At school, Carolina stood out not only because of her exotic appearance, but also because of her talents. She was intelligent, athletic, and ambitious. Her classmates remembered her as an energetic and friendly girl who was always ready to help. Her teachers noted her aptitude for math and analytical thinking. In the future, she planned to study statistics and become a specialist in this field, but fate ordered otherwise. When Carolina was 15 years old, she met Babis Anagnostopoulos, a successful civil aviation pilot 12 years older than her. Their first meeting happened by chance on an island in Greece, where Carolina went on vacation with her family. For a young girl, Babis was the embodiment of maturity and confidence. He surrounded her with attention, beautifully courted, and immediately managed to please her. Over time, their relationship developed rapidly. Bobby's knew how to create the impression of a caring and reliable partner. He gave Caroline gifts, made unexpected surprises, and promised her a future full of love and happiness. Their romantic trips, walks in Athens, and time spent together seemed like the embodiment of a fairy tale. When Carolina turned 18, the couple decided to live together. Despite the age difference, they looked like a harmonious couple. A year after the beginning of their life together, Bobis proposed to Carolina. The wedding took place on one of the picturesque Greek islands in 2019. Carolina was in a modest white dress, and the guests, among whom there were only the closest people, remembered this day as filled with joy and warmth. In 2020, their family was enlarged. The birth of a daughter, Lydia, was a happy event for Carolina. She quickly adapted to her new role as a mother, enthusiastically taking care of the infant. On social networks, she shared pictures of happy moments, signing them with the words, "My life now has found real meaning." Bobis, for his part, was proud of his family, telling his colleagues how happy he was at home. Happiness Bay. Their home in the Glikanera neighborhood was an example of coziness. Light-colored furniture, minimalist design, and lots of pictures of smiles on the walls created a sense of harmony. Neighbors spoke of them as the perfect couple. Bobis was always friendly and Carolina was warm and welcoming. However, the facade of idyll hid cracks. Over time, Caroline began to notice traits in her husband's behavior that troubled her. Barbas could be demanding, sometimes too controlling. He checked her phone, inquired about her every move, and made jealous scenes. It didn't seem threatening, but it made Caroline uncomfortable. Some friends noticed that Caroline sometimes seemed pensive and sad, but she preferred not to talk about the problems in the family. "Bobis is just worried about me. It's because of his love," she told those who asked about her mood. Soon after the birth of their daughter, Lydia, relations between the couple became more strained. Caroline was exhausted by maternal duties, and Bobis was often absent due to work. These difficulties were natural for a young family, but Caroline increasingly sought solitude. She began keeping a diary where she wrote down her thoughts and emotions, trying to make sense of what was happening. On the evening of May 10, 2021, everything looked familiar in the Crouch family home. Barbas had returned from work, and the family spent the evening together. Caroline played with Lydia, and Barbas pretended, as usual, to be tired after flying. But behind the closed doors of this seemingly perfect family, something was brewing that no one around them could have predicted. In the early morning hours of May 11, 2021, a house in the Glikanera neighborhood, surrounded by verdant trees and quiet neighborhood streets, became the center of a massive police investigation. Nothing in the neighborhood portended tragedy, but inside the house, hidden behind a neat facade, a scene played out that shocked not only the locals but the entire country. On the second floor, in a cozy bedroom under the mansard roof, police discovered the body of 19-year-old Caroline Crouch. She was lying on the bed, her face turned downward. Her hands were bound, and next to her was a cradle containing their infant 11-month-old Lydia, who fortunately remained unharmed. Next to it on the floor was Carolina's husband, Bobis Anastopoulos. His hands and feet were bound and his mouth was taped shut. The security tape had been removed from his mouth, but he was still keeping his head down. The man looked exhausted, as if he had been through a terrible ordeal. The house itself looked strange. On the first floor, the living room was scattered with things. Open drawers, overturned chairs, as if someone had been looking for something valuable. However, the furnishings did not look as if a fight had taken place. There were no signs of a struggle on the floor, typical of an unexpected intrusion. In the other rooms, order was virtually undisturbed. The staircase leading to the second floor attracted special attention of the investigators. On its railing was found a leash on which the family's dog, a young husky named Roxy, had been hung. This cruel act raised many questions. Why did the burglars, who had come for money, take the time to kill an animal? When Babis was able to speak, he told the officers his version of what happened. According to him, at about 5:30 in the morning, 3 unknown men, hiding their faces under hoods, entered the house through the basement window. They acted silently, killing the dog to avoid noise, and then went up to the bedroom where Carolina, himself, and their daughter were. Babis described the burglars as ruthless and professional. According to him, they threatened with guns, demanding money and valuables. When he pointed them to a stash of 1,000 euros, which he said should have been enough for their purposes, the criminals took the money but did not stop there. He said that one of the robbers pointed a gun at the infant, and Caroline, acting on instinct, tried to protect the child. However, her resistance only enraged the criminals. A brief struggle ensued which, according to Babis, resulted in the leader of the group deciding to kill the young woman to avoid further resistance. The criminals then allegedly tied Babis up so that he could not call for help and fled the house. The scene Babis described sounded convincing, but officers immediately had questions. The robbery, even under all the circumstances, seemed unusual. The burglars acted violently but left many valuables, including electronics and jewelry, in the house. Moreover, the manner in which Caroline and the dog were killed was beyond the scope of a typical robbery. The crime appeared personal, but evidence pointing to motives or other participants was seemingly absent. Key to the investigation was analyzing the crime scene. Investigators scrutinized every corner of the house to find anything that might shed light on the details of what happened. Were the burglars too aware of the house? Why didn't they leave any signs of forced entry on the doors and windows? In the first phase of the investigation, the investigative team focused on reconstructing the events of that night. Police interviewed neighbors to see if anyone heard suspicious noises or saw strangers. However, the neighborhood was quiet, and no one reported any suspicious activity. This added even more questions. Were the perpetrators so professional that they left no trace? Or did they really know how to avoid detection? Police officers also began examining devices found in the house, including a phone and electronic gadgets, to reconstruct a picture of the night's events. An important step was the removal of a memory card from a surveillance camera installed on the first floor. However, it was not in the camera. Someone had removed it before the crime was committed. The more time the investigators spent at the scene, the more difficult it became to understand what exactly happened that night. The situation looked confusing, and the motives of the perpetrators remained unclear. Nevertheless, the investigation began to form the first versions that were to be checked. Babis's initial testimony about the attack by the 3 robbers was taken as a basis. The investigation immediately began working according to standard procedures, searching for suspects who might have had access to information about the family and their finances, checking possible connections with criminal groups, and analyzing the evidence left at the crime scene. Gradually, however, details began to emerge that raised doubts about the veracity of the described version of events. The first thing that raised questions for the investigators was the condition of the house. For a robbery that turned into a tragedy, the disorder in the living room looked strange. Pulled-out drawers and scattered papers looked like it was done on purpose. However, nothing of value, other than the 1,000 euros Babis mentioned, had been stolen. Electronics, jewelry, and other valuables were left untouched. The police recorded that there were no signs of forced entry. There was no damage to the windows and doors, which are usually left after a break-in. This circumstance cast doubt on Bobby's words that the criminals entered through the basement window. In addition, the dog that normally sounded the alarm had been killed, but no neighbors reported the sounds of a struggle or barking. One of the key sources of information for the investigation was technological devices. Caroline's smartwatch, which she wore, was sent for analysis. This watch recorded data on her heart rate and physical activity. The police wanted to understand at what time the tragedy could have occurred in order to reconcile this with the husband's version of events. It was also important to analyze Bobby's cell phone. That night he was, according to him, tied up and unable to use the device. However, analyzing the data could help determine if there was activity that could be explained by the actions of other people in the house. After receiving a report from Bobby's unsolved that 3 burglars had broken in, investigators began a detailed examination of the Glicanera neighborhood. One of the first tasks was to examine the footage from the street surveillance cameras. It was a quiet residential neighborhood with cameras at intersections and entrances that recorded car and pedestrian traffic. Police scrutinized the footage from the night of May 11 to identify suspicious vehicles or strangers who might have been traveling in the area. Particular attention was paid to the time periods before and after the reported attack. However, to the surprise of investigators, none of the vehicles captured by the cameras aroused suspicion. All of the recorded cars belonged to local residents, whose movements were confirmed. Even stranger, none of the cameras captured the movements of people matching Bobby's description, 3 men with their faces covered. A full analysis of the recording showed that there were no intruders around the house at the time in question. This data became an important factor for the investigation. If the burglars had indeed entered the house, as Bobby claimed, they could not have done so undetected. The lack of evidence of the presence of intruders heightened the investigators' suspicions. Neighbors of the Crouch family in the Glicanera neighborhood were shocked by what happened. Police interviewed nearby residents, but none of them reported any suspicious sounds or movement in the neighborhood that night. Even the dog, according to neighbors, usually reacted loudly to intruders, but this time no one heard it barking. This became another strange circumstance. The officers also began to look into the couple's personal life. Barbas and Caroline looked like a perfect couple in photos, but Caroline's diary found in the bedroom contained entries that added a new emotional coloring to the case. In her notes, the young woman shared doubts and worries about their relationship. Some of the lines hinted at conflicts and tension between the couple, although outwardly it did not show in any way. Another important detail was Bobby's own behavior. Despite his testimony and emotional statements about the tragedy, investigators began to notice inconsistencies in his stories. He described the perpetrators as speaking Greek with a foreign accent, but could not give more details. This vagueness raised suspicion that he may have been holding something back. When police began to examine his movements on the day of the tragedy in more detail, the theory emerged that he may have been aware of something that jeopardized his family in advance. His statements about preparing for the robbery, keeping money in the house, turning off the cameras, began to look odd. Based on the information gathered, the police began to build alternative versions. Investigators doubted that the attack was committed by a group of professional robbers. Too many details indicated that the crime could have been staged. The order in the house, the selectivity of the stolen goods, the absence of signs of forced entry. The investigation into the death of Caroline Crouch continued for weeks. The details police uncovered at the crime scene began to form a picture inconsistent with the initial version of events provided by her husband Bobby's Anastopoulos. Despite his claim of an attack by 3 armed robbers, more and more evidence pointed to an internal dynamic unrelated to outside intruders. Investigators' persistence and technology were key to solving this tragedy. The first major breakthrough came from data from Caroline's smart watch. This watch, which she wore on her wrist, recorded her heart rate and physical activity. According to the information received, her heart had stopped beating even before the time that Babis called the moment of the invasion. This meant that the crime had taken place long before the mythical burglars showed up. Another important piece of evidence was the memory from the surveillance camera. Barbas claimed that the perpetrators removed the memory card to destroy the evidence. However, analysis showed that the card had been removed much earlier than the alleged attack. This discrepancy led to the first suspicion. The person who removed the memory card was most likely from the house, not a random intruder. In addition, data from Bobby's own cell phone gave investigators more reason to doubt. At times when he said he was tied up and unconscious, the phone recorded activity. The device was moving around, being used to access apps and interacting with the Wi-Fi network. This made the husband's version less and less convincing. Despite his outward activity and confidence, Barbas began to raise more and more questions for investigators. His behavior in the first days after the tragedy seemed normal for a grief-stricken husband. He attended Caroline's funeral, comforted her family, and was active with the press, publicly expressing his pain and calling for the capture of the robbers. However, close observation of his behavior revealed oddities. He was unnecessarily calm during interviews, and his descriptions of the robbers became less and less accurate. Each time he repeated the story, he would add new details or get confused about what he had already told. As the police began to ask him more detailed questions, he began to show signs of nervousness, looking away, confusing the chronology of events and changing the emphasis of his answers. A key element that heightened suspicions against Barbas was Caroline's diary found in the bedroom. In it, the young woman wrote down her experiences with the relationship. From the entries, it became obvious that their marriage was not as happy as it looked in photos on social media. In the diary, Caroline wrote about quarrels, jealousy, and pressure from her husband. She shared thoughts about leaving Barbas and described moments when she felt depressed and unhappy. One entry, dated a few days before the tragedy, contained the words, "I can't live like this anymore. I need to find a way out." These notes gave investigators an idea of a possible motive. If Caroline was indeed planning a breakup, it could have caused Barbas to feel strong emotions, especially given his control over their lives. On June 17, 2021, more than a month after the tragedy, police called Barbas in for another interrogation. This time, the investigators were confident in their suspicions and decided to confront him with the accumulated evidence. The interrogation began with questions that centered on the time of Caroline's death. The investigators detailed the data obtained from the smartwatch and asked Barbas to explain why the time of her death did not match the time of the alleged attack. At first, Barbas tried to defend himself. He argued that perhaps the watch had recorded the data incorrectly, or that the robbers could have manipulated it somehow. However, the investigators were persistent. They presented him with surveillance camera analysis and phone data that clearly showed he had been active at the time he said he was tied up. This data began to break down his confidence. When investigators moved on to Caroline's diary, Barbas became visibly nervous. He was read passages in which his wife wrote about her desire to leave the family. At this point, he began to get confused in his explanation and then, after several hours of questioning, broke down. Barbas admitted that the robbery was staged. He said that he and Carolina had an argument that night that began over a domestic disagreement, but quickly escalated into an emotional outburst. Caroline, he said, stated that she no longer wanted to stay in the marriage and planned to leave it with their daughter. During his confession, Barbas and Nastopoulos explained that the key motive for Caroline's murder was her threat to leave the marriage and take their daughter, 11-month-old Lydia, with her. According to Barbas, the thought of losing his daughter became unbearable for him. He claimed that Caroline increasingly talked about breaking up, voicing her dissatisfaction with their relationship. Barbas stated that he was willing to do anything to remain a single parent to Lydia. He could not bear the thought of his daughter growing up without him, especially if Caroline decided to move to another city or country. That fear, he says, is what drove him to the fateful decision. After the murder, he hoped to maintain control over his daughter by staging a robbery and presenting himself as a father who had survived a family tragedy. According to Babis, on the night of May 11, the conflict between him and Caroline reached a climax. She accused him of pressure, jealousy, and lack of understanding. Babis, for his part, could not accept the idea of her leaving, especially with a child. At one point, he, as he claimed, lost control of his emotions. In a fit of rage, he grabbed her, and the argument turned into a physical confrontation. By his own admission, he strangled Caroline, realizing what had happened only when it was too late. Realizing that it would look like premeditated murder, he decided to stage a robbery to ward off suspicion. Babis killed a dog to create a sense of brutality typical of professional burglars, turned over drawers and arranged things to make it look like a search for valuables. He then tied himself up and feigned a state of helplessness before calling the police. After confessing, Babis was immediately arrested. The news that he was found guilty of his wife's death sent shockwaves through the community. For Caroline's loved ones, it was particularly painful. The man they thought was the family's pillar and protector turned out to be the one who had taken their daughter and sister away from them. Little Lydia, the only survivor of that night, became the object of care from Caroline's relatives. Her grandparents expressed a desire to take custody of their granddaughter to keep her from further trauma. Babis Anagnostopoulos, who for weeks played the role of victim and grieving husband, has now become the object of public condemnation. His arrest ended the mystery but left many questions about how a man who was supposed to be protecting his family could commit such an act. The trial of Babis Anagnostopoulos began in April 2022 and became the centerpiece of Greek news. A case that was initially perceived as a brutal robbery turned into the trial of a man who murdered his wife and staged the crime. The focus was not only on the details of the case, but also on issues concerning morality, family, and justice. And by the time of the trial, the prosecutor's office had assembled an impressive dossier of evidence. The main counts of the indictment were the premeditated murder of Caroline Crouch, cruelty to an animal, and creating false evidence to mislead the investigation. Key evidence included data from Caroline's smartwatch, Babis's phone activity records, witness statements including neighbors and family friends, and her personal diary. These records were crucial to building a chronology of events, as well as understanding the relationship between the couple. Defense attorneys argued that the murder was committed in a state of passion caused by emotional instability and fear of losing the child. They argued that their client had not planned the crime in advance, but had acted out of passion. However, the prosecutor's office disputed this, citing the premeditation of the actions, including staging the robbery, killing the dog, and preparing false evidence. The court sessions were held in a tense atmosphere. Caroline's parents were the main witnesses for the prosecution and made emotional statements. Her father, David Crouch, struggled to hold back tears as he spoke about how he trusted Babis and considered him part of the family. He betrayed us. He betrayed her. He killed our daughter and then held her baby in his arms at the funeral, feigning grief, he said. The statements from Caroline's parents made a profound impression in the courtroom. Caroline's mother, Susan, added, "He always seemed calm, caring. We had no idea that he could have harbored such cruelty." Babis, for his part, acted calm and tried to appear remorseful. During his testimony, he again pleaded guilty but tried to mitigate responsibility by attributing his actions to emotional instability. "I loved Carolina. It was a temper tantrum. I didn't want her dead," he stated. However, his attempts to justify himself sounded unconvincing, especially against the backdrop of detailed evidence presented by prosecutors. Babis' attorneys tried to focus on his remorse. They argued that he was a good father and was truly sorry for what he had done. However, the judge and jury did not find this to be sufficient justification. The defense also tried to emphasize the stress Bobbis was under because of family disagreements, but prosecutors successfully challenged this argument, citing the cold-bloodedness of his actions after the murder. On May 16, 2022, the court handed down its verdict. Bobbis Anagnostopoulos was found guilty on all charges: life imprisonment for the premeditated murder of Caroline Crouch, an additional sentence of 10 years in prison for cruelty to an animal, and a fine for misleading the investigation. The judge in sentencing noted that the crime was committed with knowledge of his actions and was accompanied by attempts to avoid responsibility through manipulation and lies. The sentence was welcomed by both those present in the courtroom and the general public. After the verdict, public attention turned to the fate of Lydia, the daughter of Caroline and Bobbis. The little girl, orphaned by her own father's actions, became the object of the Crouch family's concern. Caroline's parents, David and Susan, applied for custody of their granddaughter in order to raise her in a loving environment. The court granted their request, and Lydia went to live in Manulu, Philippines, where her mother had lived as a child. Carolina's parents said they will do everything they can to shield their child from traumatic memories and ensure she has a happy future. The story of Caroline Crouch and her young daughter will always be remembered as a tragedy that raised questions about domestic violence, personal responsibility, and justice. Ellie Gould was born on February 17, 2002, in the quiet town of Calne, located in Wiltshire, England. She was the first child in the family of Matt and Caroline Gould, who spent their lives working in local businesses to provide their children with everything they needed. Ellie soon had a younger brother, Ben, and the Gould family formed a strong, friendly bond that seemed unshakable. Ellie grew up an active and inquisitive child. She was characterized by a rare mixture of discipline and charm. She easily achieved success in school, but remained a person with whom you want to be friends. As a child, Ellie had a passion for horseback riding and was often seen at the local stables helping to care for the horses. This passion continued into her teenage years, becoming not only her hobby, but also a way of expressing herself. Ellie attended Hardenhuis School, one of the best schools in the region. Teachers often spoke of her responsibility and leadership skills. She proved to be a gifted student, especially excelling in the humanities. Her academic success allowed her to seriously consider a career in law. Her family was supportive of her dream of going to university and becoming a lawyer. Ellie seemed like someone who would achieve her goals. Friends and family remembered Ellie as a helpful, kind, and very persistent girl. She was always there if anyone needed help or advice. Her mother, Caroline, often said, "She's like a ray of sunshine in our house. Everything is easier when Ellie is around." Her social circle was quite wide. Ellie easily found a common language with both peers and adults. She had a knack for being the center of attention, but never sought to stand out too much. She had a close friend who was also into horseback riding. Together, the girls planned to organize a trip to an equestrian competition in the summer of 2019. As for her personal life, Ellie started dating Thomas Griffiths, who studied at the same school. Thomas was her age, and their romance started at the age of 16. Many described their pairing as classic school love. They often appeared together, laughed, and seemed happy. But Ellie's friends noticed that her relationship with Thomas wasn't always as perfect as it seemed from the outside. Thomas, though charming and popular among his peers, had a character trait that was troubling. He was prone to jealousy and, as some of Ellie's friends said, sometimes showed excessive control over her. In early 2019, Ellie began to notice that Thomas was increasingly trying to limit her social circle. He repeatedly expressed dissatisfaction with her friendships with some classmates, accusing her of lack of attention. Ellie tried to find a compromise, but gradually began to realize that their relationship no longer brought her joy. Her parents, especially her mother, saw how this was affecting their daughter. Ellie was a strong personality, Caroline recalled, and she didn't want to live under someone else's control. In late April 2019, Ellie made the decision to part ways with Thomas. The conversation was difficult, and according to close friends, Thomas took the breakup painfully. He tried to convince her to change her mind, but Ellie remained adamant. After the breakup, Ellie seemed calm, according to her friends. She devoted herself to studying for exams, planning summer vacations and time with her family. A smile reappeared on her face, and dreams of the future seemed closer than ever. The week leading up to the tragedy went by with no apparent problems for Ellie. She attended school, played sports, and spent time with her family. Her father recalled, "We had no idea anything could be wrong. Ellie looked happy and full of energy." In the days before the tragedy, Thomas tried several times to contact Ellie, sending her messages, but received no response. Ellie, as her loved ones believed, was trying to distance herself from him to finally bring closure to this painful stage of her life. On Friday, May 3, 2019, Ellie stayed home to study for her exams. It was her last day, filled with routine and the usual rhythm of life. Ellie Gould had always been a person who knew how to deal with difficulties. Her life seemed to be on the right track, and not a single little thing foreshadowed what would happen. But on this day, the usual routine life of a quiet town will be interrupted by shocking news that will shock not only Ellie's family, but their entire small community. Friday, May 3, 2019 started out as an ordinary day for Matt Gould. He went to work in the morning, leaving his daughter Ellie at home to study for her school exams. Ellie was a diligent student and often preferred the privacy of the quiet surroundings of home to concentrate. Nothing seemed to portend trouble. Matt returned home at about 4 o'clock in the evening. When he entered the house, he felt something strange. The unusual silence, almost oppressive, seemed unfamiliar to him. Usually Ellie was listening to music or talking to friends on the phone, but now the house seemed empty. "Ellie?" he called out. Going from room to room, there was no response. Going upstairs, he peered into her room. Everything looked to be in its place. The bed neatly made, books stacked on the table. Realizing she wasn't upstairs, he went downstairs and headed for the kitchen. It was there that Matt was greeted by a sight that would change his life forever. On the floor, next to an overturned chair, lay Ellie. Her hair was strewn across the tiles, and there were dark stains around her body that were impossible to miss. It was clear from the first glance that she showed no signs of life. "No! No!" Matt exclaimed, rushing toward his daughter, but as he got closer, he realized there was nothing he could do. Struggling to control his panic, Matt called the emergency services. His voice was shaky and his words jumbled, but he was still able to explain to the operator what had happened. Medics arrived on the scene within minutes, but their conclusion was unequivocal. Ellie was dead. After the medics arrived, the police immediately began examining the scene. From the very beginning, detectives began to figure out that this was not an accident or an intentional accident. The marks on Ellie's body, the furnishings in the kitchen, many things pointed to the violent nature of the incident, but it was impossible to draw conclusions right away. The kitchen where the body was found looked quite ordinary at first glance: a table, chairs, a half-drunk mug of tea. But on closer inspection, detectives found signs of a struggle. One of the chairs had been overturned, and there were marks on the floor as if someone had fought back and tried to defend himself. The items on the kitchen table drew the most attention. Ellie's book and study notebook lay open, as if her studies had been abruptly interrupted. It seemed that Ellie had been studying for her exams and had not expected anyone to be in the house. Of particular importance to the investigation was the knife, which appeared to be the weapon of the crime. Detectives immediately noticed its location and condition, suggesting that it may have been taken from the kitchen stand. Another detail that raised questions was the small marks on the tiles that did not belong to family members. They were barely visible, but their shape and character left room for identification. Police began by questioning the family. Ellie's mother, Caroline, was at work at the time of the tragedy, her alibi confirmed by colleagues. Younger brother Ben was at school and did not return home until after police arrived. Matt Gould was also out of the house for most of the day. Caroline couldn't hold back tears as she recalled the morning she last saw her daughter alive. She seemed so calm. We talked about how her day was going to go, and she said she wanted to focus on her studies, she recounted. Interviews with neighbors yielded no significant results. No one heard screams or other suspicious noises that might indicate what was going on in the house. However, one of the neighbors recalled seeing a figure outside the Goulds' home that morning, which could speak to the presence of another person in the house besides Ellie, which completely discarded the options of a voluntary demise. But because of the distance, he was unable to describe it in detail. The keys to Ellie's house were missing. The door was locked from the inside, which meant that the killer had either left the house, having previously locked the door, or had access to a duplicate key. These details were beginning to line up into a bigger picture, which, however, remained incomplete for now. One of the strangest features of the crime scene was its relative cleanliness. Although signs of a struggle were obvious, the killer seemed to have made a deliberate effort to cover his tracks. The knife had been neatly placed in Ellie's hand, and several bloodstains on the floor looked as if they had been partially wiped away. This indicated that the perpetrator had lingered in the house after the murder. Forensics believed that the perpetrator may have acted with a certain degree of calculation, although his actions were far from flawless. Numerous pieces of evidence were collected at the crime scene, each of which required careful analysis. The police realized that the coming days would be crucial. It was necessary to understand who could have entered Ellie's house on that fateful day, why she was seized by such terrible violence, and what exactly drove the attacker to such brutal actions. Ellie herself, according to her parents and friends, was a person who tried to avoid conflict. She had no enemies, and her life seemed filled with nothing but studies, hobbies, and family plans. The operatives felt that the clue was closer than it seemed. Days after the tragedy, Wiltshire detectives on the Ellie Gould case were slowly building a chain of events. The crime scene seemed to speak to them, though not immediately. The evidence left behind by the killer began to form a disturbing picture. The first piece of evidence was the kitchen knife used in the crime. It was found in Ellie's hand, which immediately raised questions for investigators. There were no fingerprints on the handle. The surface had been thoroughly wiped clean. Experts suggested that the knife had been deliberately placed in the victim's hand to create a false impression of what had happened. "This is an attempt to confuse the investigation," explained one of the detectives. Such a move indicated that the perpetrator not only tried to conceal his identity, but also stayed at the scene long enough to stage the details. The second key piece of evidence was a fragment of cloth found under Ellie's fingernails. Experts concluded that it was a piece of cotton fabric, most likely from a t-shirt or sweater. In addition, there were visible scratches on the girl's skin, which indicated that she had tried to defend herself, leaving marks on her attacker. Ellie's cell phone drew particular attention from the police. After analyzing call and message data, detectives discovered that on the day of her death, she had been texted by a man who had previously been an important part of her life. The messages were sent in the early hours of the morning, with the tone becoming increasingly insistent. One of the messages, sent an hour before the estimated time of Ellie's death, read, "We need to talk. It's important." Detectives did not reveal the sender's name, but the correspondence was an important link in the case. On the street outside the Gould's home, forensic investigators found shoe prints leading to the side of the house. After careful analysis, it was determined that the prints belonged to the shoes of a teenager or young adult. They did not match any of the family members. These footprints matched the description of a neighbor who had seen a figure outside Ellie's house during the morning hours. "I can't tell you exactly who it was," he told police officers. "It was a young guy, maybe a friend or a classmate." Another detail discovered at the crime scene raised many questions for investigators. The perpetrator clearly stayed in the house after the deed, trying to cover his tracks, but his actions combined impulsiveness and a strange attempt to create a false impression of what had happened. On the kitchen table, everything looked ordinary. A cup of tea, Ellie's notebook open, as if she had just interrupted her studies. However, the knife used in the attack was not at the scene of the crime, but carefully placed in Ellie's hand. Forensics quickly noticed that the knife handle was missing fingerprints. This immediately alerted the detectives, as crimes of this kind committed in a fit of anger are rarely accompanied by such thoughtful actions. Upon closer inspection, the experts determined that the knife had been washed before it was placed in the girl's hand. Water residue and barely visible traces of detergent on the blade confirmed this hypothesis. "We see here an attempt at staging," explained one of the forensic experts. "The perpetrator was not only trying to cover his tracks, but also wanted to lead us down a false path, making it look as if Ellie had picked up the knife herself." However, this plan didn't seem well thought out. Despite attempts to erase the prints, the perpetrator was unable to completely disguise his actions. The knife was placed in Ellie's hand too unnaturally. Her fingers did not clutch the handle, and her posture did not correspond to the version as if she could use it herself. On the floor next to the body, the experts found smeared bloodstains. This indicated that the perpetrator had tried to erase the marks after the attack, but had made mistakes himself in the process. These marks, along with other evidence, played a crucial role in the further investigation. In addition, the lack of keys to the house further confused the situation. The killer had clearly left the house by locking the door from the inside, which made the investigators wonder, how did he get out? And why did he decide to stay in the house after the deed was done? "It's a strange mix of impulsiveness and calculation," one of the detectives noted. "He didn't plan the whole thing, but he had the coolness to try to confuse us. That suggests he was probably panicked, but he also realized what he had done." The staging attempt did not help the perpetrator avoid suspicion. On the contrary, it became an important part of the investigation, showing not only his inexperience but also the intense emotional strain he was under. As evidence and witness statements were collected, investigators began to reconstruct the last hours of Ellie's life. They determined that she had received several messages in the morning and had likely made an appointment with a person she trusted. Police speculated that this person may have been well known to her and her family, or Ellie would not have let him into the house. Based on analysis of the phone data, the timing of footprints at the scene, and witness statements, detectives' suspicions began to focus on a certain figure. The name of Thomas Griffiths, Ellie's classmate and former young man, soon became key to the investigation. Thomas was the one who sent her the messages on the morning of May 3. His behavior in recent days also raised questions. After breaking up with Ellie, Thomas, as her friends recalled, became obsessive. He tried to repair the relationship, texting her and attempting to meet up several times. When police called him in for questioning, Thomas claimed that he was at home on the morning of May 3, but his parents could not accurately confirm his alibi. Moreover, Experts noticed that the clothes he was wearing that day were missing. Analysis of a fragment of fabric from under Ellie's fingernails confirmed that it belonged to a sweater similar to the one Thomas had worn earlier. The evidence gathered made Thomas the prime suspect. After the murder of Ellie Gould, Thomas Griffiths did everything he could to cover up his involvement. One of his main steps was to create an alibi. He stated that during the morning hours of May 3, he was at school, where his mother allegedly drove him. "My mom dropped me off at school around 9 a.m., Thomas claimed during his first interrogation. "After that, I was in class until lunchtime." At first, his words seemed convincing. However, when investigators began to verify this version, serious inconsistencies emerged. Thomas's mother did confirm that she drove her son to school that morning, but video surveillance data at the entrance to the school showed that Thomas never entered the building. That detail shattered his initial alibi. After determining that Thomas left the school grounds shortly after his mother dropped him off, police began reconstructing his route during the morning hours. Investigators found that after his mother left him outside the school, Thomas headed to a bus stop nearby. CCTV cameras captured him boarding a bus going to the neighborhood where Ellie lived. A witness who lived in Ellie's neighborhood also recalled seeing a young man who looked like Thomas near the girl's home around 10 a.m. "I noticed him when I was walking my dog. The guy looked like he was waiting for someone," the witness told police. This data allowed detectives to restore the chronology of events. Thomas arrived in the neighborhood of Ellie's house shortly before her death. The first interview with Thomas took place a few days after the murder. Detectives immediately noticed that he was tense, but tried to remain confident. When asked about his whereabouts on the day of the murder, he continued to insist on his story. "I was at school. My mom drove me there in the morning, and then I was studying for exams." However, when detectives presented him with CCTV evidence showing he had not been to school, Thomas faltered. "Maybe I stayed out late," he tried to justify himself. When presented with evidence of his trip to the area of Ellie's house, he became confused in his answers. Thomas admitted that he had been near her house, but claimed that he just wanted to see her to talk to her. "I didn't go inside," he asserted. However, forensic investigators uncovered evidence that proved otherwise. Thomas's shoe tracks matched the prints found outside Ellie's house, and fragments of fabric under her fingernails matched the material of his clothes. After several interrogations in which Thomas Griffiths strenuously denied his involvement, the evidence collected by investigators began to put him under intense pressure. When forensic evidence was presented, including matching shoe prints to those found outside Ellie's house and analysis of the fabric from under her fingernails, Thomas realized it was pointless to continue denying the obvious. During the next interrogation, he finally admitted that he had gone to Ellie's house on the morning of May 3. His tone became less confident and his voice shook as he began to give new testimony. "Yes, I came to Ellie's house. I wanted to talk to her. All because of our breakup." However, even in this confession, he tried to justify his actions. Thomas claimed that their meeting began peacefully but quickly turned into an argument. "She told me that she did not want to communicate anymore, that between us, everything is over. I couldn't accept that," he told investigators. He went on to describe that the argument became more emotional, and then, he claimed, the situation got out of control. "It was an accident. I didn't mean for it to happen," he insisted. Those words, however, could not explain why Thomas took such deliberate action after the incident. Detectives drew his attention to the erased fingerprints from the knife and the fact that the weapon had been placed in Ellie's hand. If it was an accident, why did you remove your fingerprints? Why did you try to create a false picture of what happened? One of the investigators asked a direct question. At this point, Thomas fell silent. After a pause, he tried to justify himself. "I was scared. I realized it looked terrible. I didn't know what to do." Yet experts understood that his actions after the murder indicated a clear consciousness of guilt. Thomas didn't just leave the crime scene, he tried to cover his tracks by carefully erasing the handle of the knife and placing it in Ellie's hand to create the illusion that she could have used the weapon herself. These actions showed that he not only realized the gravity of what he had done, but that he was deliberately trying to cover up his guilt. Fear is one thing, but such actions show deliberation, the investigator emphasized. At this stage, it became clear that Thomas partially admitted his involvement, but tried to present what happened as a spontaneous act devoid of premeditation. After experts confirmed Thomas's connection to key evidence, including a fabric fragment and shoe prints, the investigation decided to proceed. Thomas's arrest took place on the morning of May 8, 2019. Police arrived at his home with a warrant, and he offered no resistance. "We knew he understood why we were here," one officer recalled. At the police station, Thomas looked distressed, but continued to insist he had not planned anything bad. His story, however, did not stand up to fact-checking. Now, investigators were preparing to take the case to court, where he would have to answer for his actions. The trial of Thomas Griffiths began in the fall of 2019. The prosecution and defense presented their versions of events, each of which was based on the collected evidence and the defendant's behavior. The hearing generated a great deal of public interest as the case unfolded in great detail, emphasizing both the cold-bloodedness and emotional intensity that the case involved. The prosecution insisted that the murder of Ellie Gould was not simply the result of impulsive behavior, but a premeditated act. The evidence presented indicated that Thomas Griffith not only deliberately went to Ellie's house on the day of the murder, but also took purposeful action to cover up his guilt. The prosecution argued that Thomas's visit to Ellie's house was premeditated. On the day of the murder, he left the school shortly after his mother brought him there and went to her house. CCTV cameras recorded his route, which refuted his claims that he was allegedly at the school. Prosecutors emphasized that Thomas had specifically insisted on meeting Ellie, sending her texts during the morning hours. Key to the case was evidence proving his presence at the scene. Analysis of phone data and testimony from neighbors confirmed that Thomas was near Ellie's house at the time of the murder. Forensic evidence showed that a fragment of fabric found under Ellie's fingernails matched the clothes Thomas had worn that day, but later discarded in an attempt to cover his tracks. The prosecution paid particular attention to Thomas's actions after the murder. His attempts to wipe fingerprints off the knife, put the weapon in Ellie's hand and put it back in its place spoke of a deliberate attempt to stage the murder. These actions, prosecutors argued, proved that Thomas realized the gravity of what he had done and sought to confuse the investigation. This was not a spontaneous crime, but a conscious murder in an attempt to avoid responsibility, the prosecutor emphasized. Thus, the prosecution presented Thomas as a person who, acting under the influence of jealousy and anger, deliberately committed the murder and then tried to cover up his guilt. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to portray Thomas' actions as an impulsive and unintentional act, caused by severe emotional distress over the breakup of his relationship with Ellie. Thomas came to Ellie's house to talk, the defense attorney stated. Their conversation became tense, leading to the tragic incident. The main line of defense was to argue that Thomas had no intent to harm. They argued that the murder was the result of a sudden outburst of emotion, and the subsequent attempts to cover up the tracks were due to fear and panic. The defendant was a young man who found himself in a situation he could not cope with. He realized what he had done and could not accept reality, the defense insisted. However, the defense could not explain why Thomas wiped the fingerprints off the knife and put it in Ellie's hand and took other steps to stage the attack. On November 19, 2019, after weeks of hearings, the court concluded that Thomas Griffith's actions were premeditated. The judge noted that the careful attempt to stage the crime scene, the removal of fingerprints and discarded clothing, indicated that his actions were deliberate. Your attempts to cover your tracks and create a false impression of what happened do not indicate panic, but a clear understanding of the consequences, the judge emphasized. Thomas Griffiths was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years and 6 months. Before the possibility of parole. This verdict was the culmination of a case that demonstrated the importance of attention to detail in the investigation and the impartiality of the court in dealing with such complex cases.